Standoff. =RK=. Part 1. Senate Building. Coruscant. The aftermath of bringing Dooku in was underwhelming. He was stuck into a cell within the Jedi Temple and was awaiting a trial. Surprise, surprise, the courts were dragging their legs for weeks. Nothing unexpected with Sidious being the Chancellor. I got a lot of praise and was stuck in front of reporters more times than I cared about. I had to use all the skills I learned and rely heavily on the Force in order to leave a positive impression with the media, all the while giving vague answers about my origins. Somehow people didn't know yet who and what I really was, and I was determined to keep that going for as long as practical. Sidious had me sidelined by using me for propaganda purposes until my new command was being assembled. That was a slow and nerve-wracking process without the efficiency of the Empire to which I was accustomed. Yet it was understandable. High Command had no idea where I came from, and the Jedi in the chain of command didn't trust me at all for obvious reasons. At least they weren't spreading my origin to anyone who asked, so they might not be all bad, and wasn't that an unreal thought? All it left me bored out of my mind with necessary paperwork, which thankfully consisted of no actual paper and mountains of electronic memos and forms that needed my attention and signatures. Meanwhile, the war was going on. The capture or death of some of the CIS's most prominent leaders did little to deter the enemy. Their overwhelming numbers allowed them to carry on with their offensives all across the galaxy. It wasn't all bad. Without Dooku and Grievous, the Confederate war machine was running out of steam, though I doubted it would be for long. Without their best commanders, the Separatists were suffering punishing losses and soon would have to stop and consolidate their forces. Figure out who must be in charge too. If the strategic projections were correct, and with my new access to raw intelligence data I had no reason to doubt them, the enemy advance would have to stop by the time my fleet was assembled. Just in time for me to participate in the planned counteroffensive. While I was cooling my heels on Coruscant, the Jedi I was familiar with were busy getting into trouble. Ahsoka, who had rejoined her master citing need for a couple of calm weeks after my stunt on Florum, was currently missing along with Skywalker and Aayla Secura. Anakin and the kid went to relieve the Twi'lek Jedi Master, whose fleet was under heavy Separatist attack. They managed to get her away from her burning flagship, but Skywalker got wounded in the process. To make matters worse, the Chosen One's luck struck again. The frigate on which the Jedi were evacuating was damaged and made a blind hyperspace jump. The Navy was still searching for them. If my memory was still accurate and the changes I've already made did not affect the outcome of their flight, the Jedi should be found safe and sound. Eventually. Kenobi was stuck on some ice moon where the locals were at odds with the members of the species living on a nearby planet, who were a Republic member. For once the Senate had voted swiftly, probably because the Chancellor was too busy arranging the trials of the CIS leaders we had in custody. And finally Shark T was sent to Knossos, was it? Something sounding like that, where the clankers were crushing the locals. So despite the butterflies I made, things were not changed too much from canon yet. Not that meant much, here where it was all real and not a movie you could watch from bed while munching on popcorn. That was something I figured out the hard way when I ended up in the Empire. The galaxy was inconceivably large, and what movies, games and books showed was merely scratching the surface. I knew this was merely the calm before a storm that would shake the whole galaxy. The war was going to escalate. I had to make sure of it, or Sidious would keep holding an insurmountable advantage. At that time little did I know that I was playing a different game than the one I thought was going on. At least it wasn't all bad. The time I spent on Coruscant engaged in publicity stunts and buried under mountains of paperwork gave me a breather that I sorely needed. After losing everything I knew, everything I spent decades working for, I needed that time to screw my head more or less right. The dark side's whispers were getting more and more tempting as of late. Without the calm period post-Florum I might have willingly given in and done something regrettable. On the plus side, I got time to plot, straighten up my goals and set up some short-term plans. Little did I know they would all be thrown askew very soon. I had no idea what monumental mess I would need to clean up shortly. I was making my way towards the Chancellor's office and wondered what went to hell this time. I only knew that I was called there for an emergency meeting, never a good sign unless it was a part of one of your plots. Needless to say, whatever shenanigans were going this time, they weren't of my doing, even if they might be an unintended consequence of my meddling. I wasn't alone. 2 men followed me and none of them were Jedi. With the relentless onslaught the Sith was throwing against the Republic after the loss of their military leaders, the Council no longer had the luxury of keeping a Jedi Master as my babysitter. For the moment they were content to let me deal with the Republic media, which was a crippling pain in the ass. Those vultures were not diligently trained like our own Imperial ones. I am sure that more than one Jedi laughed off their asses on my expense, the bastards. That's why one of the shenanigans I planned was to use the media to turn public opinion against the Jedi if the opportunity presented itself. Doing so would be a lance in their credibility if they ever tried to move against me. The lack of a Jedi breathing in my neck made the irritating stuff I had to deal with lately more or less worth it. Getting my face shown to the masses as the man responsible for the greatest coup against the Separatists since the start of the war won me a lot of points and gave me some security that the Council would have serious problems with removing me without a very good cause. And even then it might be with GAR High Command kicking and screaming all the way, even if they didn't trust me. Most of the brass loved me for delivering Dooku and Grievous in their laps. They were content to use my skills as long as play ball, and many of them wouldn't appreciate Jedi meddling. It should not be surprising. The Jedi of this era were not particularly good in the PR department, and that was the main reason why almost no one bat an eye when Sidious executed Order 66. The very fact that they let me show my face to the media without a concerned campaign to discredit me was proof of that. But that is a topic for another time. I was walking towards the Chancellor's office accompanied by my aide Piet, whose skills were invaluable for dealing with the unholy mess that was assembling a new fleet and attached army group from scratch. With us was the newest talent I managed to grab. It was a certain Lieutenant Maximilian Veers. I had arranged his transfer from the militia unit on his home world he was serving with to my command. I had noticed that he had requested multiple times to be sent to a Walker unit, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears. So I drew few strings at GAR headquarters, and the tall officer was sent a one-way ticket to Coruscant. He arrived at my office 15 minutes before I was called to see Palpatine. We had just met after I finished with most of the daily paperwork and had a time for a long chat with the man. During our talk he presented me with some novel ideas about the use of walkers of all types as well as more conventional armor. So I decided to take him with me and continue our interview on our way to meet the Chancellor. If there was any flaws I could find in such short time, it was that Veers was too enamored with walkers to the expense of anything else. That was something I would be discouraging. On the bright side, he had prior experience with infantry where he had spent his career so far. With careful management, he could become a splendid and well-rounded ground forces commander, something that I currently lacked. There was a reason I did not want clones in overall command of any branch of the forces on my disposal. It was the same one I was pushing for the promotion of Palion to Commodore and my naval XO. I still did not know how good the control Sidious had over the clones was. The various rumors I remembered from my universe were not something I could afford to take for granted. == Chancellor's Office, Senate Building, Coruscant. Something unusual was happening, that's for certain. I found Yoda and Windu talking with Palpatine. They were saying that the Jedi were spread too thin. With Skywalker and Sakura missing, that was probably true. To make it even funnier, at least from my point of view, the newest hotspot was Naboo. That planet had to be cursed. It was a major point of embarrassment when the Grand Master of the Jedi Order had to tell the Chancellor that there were no Jedi available to go help his home world. Little did I know that I should savor that great moment while I had the opportunity. Well, I did so anyway. Palpatine was glaring at the Masters to my utter delight. The only thing I regretted was that I was not wearing my helmet, which was being upgraded by few trustworthy engineers in HQ. So no recording of this show. It was a pity that Piet and Veers were waiting outside and missed it. Am I to understand that you couldn't spare a single Jedi to go to Naboo? Palpatine asked quietly. The sheer betrayed incredulity he could put in his disbelieving voice was worth a reward by itself. Every time I met Sidious I had to marvel how good an actor he was. It also reinforced my belief that playing the political game against a man like him would be suicide even if he didn't have a few decades worth a head start. Unfortunate, it is, nodded Yoda. He was a picture of regret. Sidious glared. It was not a Sith-patented one, but it was good enough. When it became clear that the Jedi had nothing to add, I cleared my throat. I am sorry to interrupt, but it appears that I am out of the loop. What is the problem, sir? I inquired with just the right amount of deference to my nominal commander-in-chief. Separatists' presence was located on Naboo. When it became clear that we would be unable to send any meaningful forces there, Queen Niaoutni requested Jedi help. However, at the moment our Jedi friends, he spat in a bitter, betrayed tone, are unable to send anyone but few untrained Padawans, which is out of the question. I was tempted to point out that there were a pair of obviously free Jedi in front of me. But perhaps Naboo was too backwater for the esteemed council members to go there personally. I am sure that Palpatine had similar thoughts. Even if he wasn't a Sith, it would have occurred to him that two of the most powerful Jedi in existence weren't willing to go help his home world even when they were obviously free. That had to grate. With him being well Sidious, I was sure that the Chancellor would find a way to use this as an opportunity to tarnish the Jedi's image. Perhaps a few careful leaks to the media. I wondered what his game was. I remembered that something important was to happen on Naboo around this time, but the details eluded me. Was there some kind of research facility hidden there? The comm built-in Palpatine's desk beeped. When he answered, I saw Padme Amidala, Jar Jar Binks of all beings, and an opulently dressed woman whose face was covered with white and red makeup. I knew that this was no coincidence. The Force was attempting to influence things around, and I just knew it was towards something that I would not enjoy. I've learned to recognize the signs. In this universe it was true that there were seldom consequences, but there most certainly were a lot of Force-related shenanigans. Hey. That thought was probably the understatement of the decade. At least. Chancellor. Masters. The Queen gave them a small bow. We attempted to contact the Jedi Council but were told that they were speaking with you. She spoke in a regal, confident voice. How can I help you, my dear? Palpatine smiled at his former and current queen. He was the perfect picture of a sweet and helpful old man. Say what else you will about the man, but he was a superb actor who might have gotten in the wrong vocation if it wasn't the little issue of him being a Sith. We managed to retrieve some data from a damaged tactical droid, said Amidala. Please enlighten us, Senator. Windu intoned in a tone showing sudden interest. The Separatists have some kind of research facility in the eastern swamps. The droid mentioned something about a virus. Amidala explained in concerned tone. They plan to attack us. It's the only explanation, added Captain Typho after stepping into the holo projector's range. Delicate the situation is. Jedi to send I wish, said Yoda, and was promptly interrupted by Amidala. I am recommending Generals Kenobi and Skywalker. Our relationship with the Gungans are strained at present, but they trust General Kenobi. Neither of them is available at present, explained Windu. Senator. Stretched thin the order is, Yoda continued with his Emperor-cursed butchering of basic. This wasn't the fist nor the last time I wished to strangle the little troll because of it. Then General Vale should make do, said Palpatine. I am sure that the Order will send a Jedi as soon as possible. He added. The Jedi Masters looked from the Chancellor to me and back. It was obvious that they expected that I would be tied up on Coruscant until my fleet was ready, and by then they would have an agent ready to continue breathing at my back. Now they had a problem. It was obviously that they did not want to let me go without supervision. However, they had spent I don't know how long telling to Palpatine that there were no Jedi free to go before I arrived. They could not free someone to watch me now. The Jedi were in a bind. A week ago Palpatine finally put his leg down and told them that he trusted me and he won't condone such a waste of resources when I had not shown in any way my animosity to the Republic. He went as far as to outright say that he had no time for some kind of conflict between me and the Jedi. Not when I had done so much for the Republic since my appearance. If Sidious suspected that I was a Sith, he was keeping that information to himself. My only surprise was that the Jedi did not spill the beans about what I truly was. Even better, the Jedi shot themselves in the foot this time. It would look very bad for them if they could release someone to come to Naboo to be my minder but not do that in the first place to solve the locals' problem. This was an opportunity to make myself even more popular and reinforce my reputation for competence and getting results. I'll assemble a task force and head to Naboo ASAP, sir. By your leave? I declared. Palpatine gave me a grave nod. Please do so, my friend. Chancellor, Master Yoda, Master Windu. I gave them a small bow of respect which I did not feel and exited the office. Walk with me, I said to Piet and Veers. We have a fire to put down. There is a Separatist's presence on Naboo and at the moment the cupboard is rather empty. We'll be heading there right after a battle group is assembled and we have at least a regiment that is ready for action loaded on the ships." "That's a tall order, sir," Piet sighed. "I am aware of that. We have our work cut off for us. And Veers, welcome to the 11th Corps. =RK=. Part 2. Republic Cruiser Requiem. High orbit over Coruscant. It took us 10 hours to assemble a regiment with their equipment for transport. On the face of it, that was a great achievement. However, the ground forces, with the exception of few select formations, were not combat effective at that time. I knew that we'll be dealing with some kind of virus, so I was not going to send down men who didn't have good enough training and equipment for surviving an environment where such an WMD was released. I hoped that we will be able to do something about their readiness by the time we reached Naboo. I had the feeling that I won't need all forces straight away, but that was no reason to slack. The problem wasn't in the clones' individual skills. It was just that most of them hadn't received any training at combat maneuvers above the platoon level. All but 3 companies were quite green boys rushed from Camino once their basic training was over. It was less than ideal, but it was better to have them than not. On more positive note, I had managed to pull through a promotion for Palion. He was a brand new Commodore in overall command of my space forces. Those consisted of 3 Venotas, my flagship Requiem, Victory, and Undran, 5 Acclamators, including Leveler and Dauntless, as well as 6 frigate escorts. Those were the combat-ready ships which were ready for deployment. At least on paper my fleet was supposed to be much bigger, but such a force took a long time to assemble given the state of the war. Most of the new ships and ground forces were going as replacements to the formations engaged on the front lines. For the moment my command was assigned to the Strategic Reserve, which also acted as a reinforced guard for Coruscant. That explained why I was called on to clean up the mess on Naboo, besides the obvious fact that I was available. There simply were no other viable force at the moment, and no one was able to pry the various system defense forces out of their home systems, otherwise the state of the war would be much better for the Republic. Just Guat's heavy capital ships could have made a huge difference. The same went for Corellia, but the latter was currently neutral. I just got to the bridge with my small staff and clone commander VC 541 Vig, the man in charge of the clone troopers which we drafted for the mission to Naboo. "Are we ready to depart?" I asked calmly, without showing any of the weariness I felt in my tone. The scramble to get everything ready was exhausting even when I could lean on the Force to rejuvenate my body. "Yes, General. My men are on board. However, only 1 battalion and 2 reinforced companies are combat effective as we speak. We'll need at least a week for the whole regiment to be ready, sir," Vic reported. That was worse than the reports I got so far. Joy. "Concentrate to the units that could be prepared fastest. We may not have that long," I ordered. "Commodore, take charge of the task force. We are leaving." I turned to Palion. "Yes, sir." Palion gave me a salute and went to follow my orders. "Lieutenant Veers, I want you on the ground with me on this op. I want to judge your abilities for myself." My attention shifted to my new protégé. "Yes, sir." Maximilian straightened up. "I won't disappoint you, General. Carry on, men." =RK=. City of Theed. Naboo. The journey to Naboo was barely long enough for us to have another battalion ready for combat. By the time we made orbit I had on my disposal 2 infantry battalions, or to use the Garlingo legions, 1,000-men formations that were prepared for deployment. There were also 2 armor companies with walkers and 1 scout platoon. The rest of my ground forces would need at least 2 more days before I would consider sending them in combat, with the last battalion being more or less a lost cause after we cannibalized it for men and equipment. I hoped that it was going to be enough. A few minutes after arriving in the system I was in alert descending towards the city of Theed. The movies didn't do it justice. The city was built on a large plateau around a waterfall. As we approached, Theed was lit up by sun rays from the east, bathing it in golden shower. The combination of the sun, the domed architecture and warm pastel tones topped by green made by a stunning vista. It was one of the most amazing things I've seen, and I've been to 3 different universes. We landed at what appeared to be the same hangar scene in The Phantom Menace, where we were met by Captain Typho, a female Gungan, and C-3PO. I introduced myself and my companions, Piet and Veers. Not seeing the senator, I rolled my eyes in exasperation. "Let me guess, Captain." Senator Amidala went ahead by herself. I grumbled. As if dealing with a CIS research lab containing who knew what nasty surprises wasn't complicated enough. Senator Padme can't be stopped when she makes up her mind. The droid added his 2 cents. Why didn't she take that blasted machine too? Then the CIS might finally get lucky and do us all a favor by blasting it to many tiny pieces. Captain, I recommend that the next time she goes suicidal you stun her. I grumbled. Where exactly did she run to? This is Peppy Bay. Padme sent her here. She is the last person to see them. Typho introduced the alien woman. Them? Did she for a change decide to take guards with her this time? I asked with forlorn hope. It did not matter what was my opinion about Amidala and her antics. Hell, even what Sidious thought about her was not that important in this situation. She was the senator of Naboo, a former queen and personal friend of the Chancellor. If she got herself killed on my watch it won't be good. I was sure that Sidious would use such an opportunity to send me and my forces somewhere we won't be able to make too much trouble while using her death to further his agenda. I would have done the same in his shoes. I hate politics. Representative Binks is with her. Typho admitted with a straight face. Of course he is. Getting rid of him should be achievable. I hoped. That bloody thing had the Emperor's own luck. Am I wrong to assume that you are searching for them? I asked. She doesn't have a proper security detail, does she? I sighed. Probably not. Not with Padme's luck. She undoubtedly was already captured and needed saving. Bloody royals. Considering what happened, we decided to wait for your arrival, General. Typho sounded even less happy to tell me the next bit of good news. Please enlighten us. I can't wait. My sarcasm was not lost on the captain, who winced. Ensign Piet, talk with the lady and arrange the last known location of our missing senators to be scouted from orbit. I'm on it, sir. Firmus saluted and went to talk with the Gungan woman. Typho led us to a small ready room nearby, which was dominated by a large holodisplay in the form of a table. In its center laid the head of B1 droid. He pressed a couple of buttons and a holographic representation of a humanoid man floated over the table. This is Dr. Nuvo Vindi. He was a famous doctor who disappeared years ago. The captain intoned in a grave tone. The resident mad scientist started a monologue about having enough blue shadow to start filling bombs with it. I winced. I was familiar with that crippling disease. It was a nasty piece of work even by Sith standards. That right there should tell you something about the virus. If this abomination is released in enough key places, it can easily cause a galactic pandemic that will make the war look like a children's spat. I spat. That was the last thing we needed to deal with. The only good thing about Blue Shadow was that in order to be most effective it needed bodies of water to spread through. Otherwise, it was a short-lived horror. It would be a nasty shock to world like Coruscant. On Naboo? If left unchecked for even a short period of time it might wipe out most of the population, and considering how much water was on this planet, the whole world would be in quarantine for months, perhaps years before the virus could be eradicated. A quarantine that must be enforced, thus depleting the Navy's meager reserves. I'll have my ships scan the area. Let's hope that the Senator has not revealed that we suspect about the virus, I sighed. If she was captured, the CIS garrison would be on alert. I contacted Palion, who sent the frigates to sweep over the eastern marshes from orbit. 5 minutes later we had the location of the lab and its rough plans, which showed 3 separate entrances as well as an area with increased radiation. That was most likely the armory where the bombs were being assembled. Fortunately, in order to keep a low profile, the base didn't have jammers running, which would have made getting detailed scans impossible. It wasn't really surprising. Planet-side the ECM couldn't be missed. The CIS facility had at least 10 disc-shaped rooms and something which looked like a shaft leading to the surface. They all were connected with tunnels. This could get ugly. Veers, I want you leading teams of demolitions experts to the armory. You are to disarm all bombs you find there. I'll go after our friendly WMD expert. I glanced at the lieutenant, who had his helmet in the crook of his left arm. And don't forget that we are dealing with a bioweapon. I want the armors of all my men sealed tight. Before we headed for the marches, I left Piet back as a liaison to Typho and the rest of the locals. Amidala and the Gungan menace were most likely captured and thus costing us the element of surprise. If we were lucky for once, they were simply lost and we would have more enough time to search for them. Or if we fucked up, they were dead anyway, as well as most of the population of Naboo. == RK=, CIS Bioweapons Lab. Eastern Marshes. Naboo. I had no illusions that the perimeter of the Separatists' base was anything but seeded with copious amount of sensors. I had only a handful of clones who were trained for stealth insertions. If I had a squad or two of Republic commandos, I would have led them in covertly so we would know what exactly we were dealing with. In such a case we would have done our best to seize the part of the base where the bombs were located and hold it while my main forces assaulted the place. That was a luxury we did not have. The attack began with an airstrike by squadron of Torrents which screamed in from orbit and launched missiles at the southern part of the base, as far from where we believed the bombs and the virus were located as possible. The evening which had just descended over the marshes was illuminated by a crescendo of roaring explosions that shook the enemy facility to its foundations. I was in the back of the lot with the first wave of our assault. Next to me a healed cat and his men were ready to rappel to the ground the moment we were over the target. The leading gunships unleashed AP missiles at the tunnels which were our chosen entrance points. On 5 separate places the ceilings of the base's corridors were breached. Seconds later a transport stopped above each of the new entrances and clones were rappelling down after throwing in iron and smoke grenades. I was the first out of my lot and didn't bother with rappelling down. I just jumped out and for a couple of seconds enjoyed the sensation of free falling. The sensation would have been much better if I was not encased in my sealed armor, which was now painted with an expensive smart paint that changed color depending on the environment. I wanted eventually all my men to have such a camouflage, but at least for now that was too expensive to contemplate. 5,000 credits only for my armor and a kit which would repair the coating if it was damaged by enemy fire. When you consider that I wanted all my ground troops to have it, you suddenly start talking about real money. A moment after jumping I called on the force and enveloped myself with an energy field that absorbed most of my momentum. Just before I hit the ground, I pumped even more power in the sheath around me. I landed lightly and the energy around me discharged in a shockwave that threw away everything within the tunnel. Behind me a pair of synthetic ropes fell in the corridor and Cat and his men rappelled down. The chatter of my other units deploying in the facility sounded in my ears. This is Veers. We are pinned down by destroyer droids. Vic, vector at teams to the lieutenant's position. All units advance. I ordered, and after making sure the tunnel was clean for the moment I closed my eyes and concentrated on the whispers of the force. I could feel the somewhat dull presence of the clones. I could see where Veers was taking cover at an intersection. He was waving an AT team, which had just jumped in behind him to deal with a trio of droidicas. The shielded war droids were turning that path to the armory into a shooting gallery. There. About 100 meters from where I stood were 3 people, 2 of whom were familiar. Yep. Amidala and Jar Jar got caught. Again. Number 3 must be my target. I ran in that direction followed by Cat and 10 clones. The rest of his men were fanning out to secure our rear. The next lot would get in enough troops so they could push for the other entrance of the armory. Or make themselves a new one. The only resistance I faced were 2 B1s and a single super battle droid. Needless to say, those machines were unable to even slow us down. I deflected blaster bolts at the 2 flimsy clankers and cut into their big brother as I passed by it. One of the clones shot the SB in the face when he ran over it. Just in case, I guess. I found the doc and his captives behind a blast door which was made mostly by a transparent material. I guess it was more for a virus containment than for stopping a determined assault. There were a bunch of droids standing at attention behind him too. There weren't enough of the clankers to make a difference. It took me 5 seconds to cut a circle in it and jump through. My men were right behind me. Senator. We should stop meeting like this. I quipped at Amidala, who sent me a disgruntled look. The Senator and Jar Jar were on the ground, next to some kind of generator. They were tied to something that was looking like a big Tesla coil attached to said power source. Another step and your friends are dead, sneered Vindy. He pressed down a switch he was holding and his captives were shocked by arching bolts of electricity. Throw down your weapons, he shouted. Vindy sounded like he actually expected us to comply. Idiot. I shook my head in exasperation and used the force. The Mad Doctor screeched when I used telekinesis to snap his left arm like a twig and shut down the current coursing through his captives. Kill them, he gasped an order to the droids in the room. I was already charging forward and was amongst the machines, before they could comply. I telekinetically blasted the droids on my left at the nearby wall and deflected few shots from the faster droids on my other side. Cat and his troopers wasted no time and cheerfully started blasting the distracted clankers to little pieces. I diagonally slashed through the torso of a B-1 droid, sent back couple of shots to another which flew back disabled, and slammed my lightsaber to the hilt in the chest of a super battle droid which was about to mow down my men with its wrist-mounted dual blaster. I flourished my blade which was embedded in its torso and the droid fell to the ground in 4 glowing pieces. The skirmish was over as fast as it began. The machines were down and only 3 of my men were wounded, none of them critical. However, their armors were breached. Which was very bad considering that in the commotion Vindy had his hale hand around a vial of blue gas. I should have stunned the bastard. I knew better than to underestimate crazy scientists. "It's too late, fools," Vindy shouted and threw it at the ground. Before the vial could hit the metal floor and shatter, I caught it gently with the force. The doctor just grinned at me dementedly and looked at his shattered left arm. There was a metal brace around it with a prominent red button, in a circle around which were small lights glowing crimson. The first one blinked out. "Time is running out," he taunted. "General, we found the bombs. They are all active," Veers called over the comm. "Start disarming them," I snapped. I stared at the madman who had his head protected by a transparent crystal dome. I could see it in his eyes. There was no way to remotely disarm the bombs. "In the unlikely event we are unable to stop all the bombs, you'll be taking some of your own medicine," I said and used my powers to shatter the bubble protecting him. "Commander Vic, I want all of my men whose armor was breached to evacuate back to the decontamination areas set up on the assault ships. Veers, disarm the bombs and check if they contain vials of the virus. We can't afford to miss ever one of those things. Lieutenant Cat, get Senators Amidala and Binks out of here." "Wait a minute. I am going nowhere until I know that Naboo is safe," snapped Padme. "Stun her if you have to." I ignored her protests and headed out while dragging Vindy using the Force. I knew that there was something important I was forgetting. I was wondering what it was when I sensed a movement in a side corridor. I found there a ridiculous-looking, small droid which was clutching a bomb in its manipulators. That was it. I plucked the bomb from its clutches and sent a lightning bolt at the little bugger. I watched with satisfaction as its circuits fried under the onslaught and then its plating started melting. "He'll unleash a virus on my men, won't he? Serves him right." I disarmed the bomb and retrieved the vial. Well, that was done. I was such a fool to think that it would be that easy. Near the city of Theed, Naboo. A figure cloaked in a black mantle leaned on a tree overlooking the river that passed through the capital of Naboo. He observed the opening stages of the assault over the research lab before Republic jamming cut off the feeds. He waited for 5 minutes before sending a signal to one of a few heavily shielded against detection listening stations spread around the facility. They were connected with the lab by landlines, so the jamming was not an issue. With that done, the man whose face was hidden by a black mask went to a speeder bike parked nearby. He retrieved 4 spherical devices from a compartment at the back of his ride and went to the river. He pressed 2 buttons on each of the small drones and threw them in the water. The current would do the rest. He returned to his speeder and activated a holocom which was built in it. A figure whose features were hidden by a hood appeared. "Phase 1 is done, my master," rasped the man on Naboo. "Well done. We shall have our vengeance." The man was long gone by the time the drones detonated on the outskirts of the city. Soon Theed was engulfed by a blue mist. He never knew he was a mere pawn serving 2 very different masters. =RK=, Cis Bioweapons Lab. Eastern Marshes, Naboo. I was near alert, landed on the surface above the enemy base along with my captive. We were waiting for Kat, who was escorting a protesting Amidala to one of the gunships. She had decided to comply without needing to be stunned, but was making it clear how displeased she was with the poor lieutenant. That's when hell went loose. All the warning I got was a mere flicker through the force signifying I wasn't really in any notable danger. Subdued thumps sounded throughout the facility. Ear-piercing alarms started blaring. I turned my head to the nearest hole in the ground which was leading to the underground base. That didn't sound good. "Veers, report," I snapped. "Some kind of internal detonations, General. The containment procedures on the base are going in effect. There is blue smoke coming from the vents," he reported. "Get out of there. Now," I ordered. General. We have a serious problem over here, Piet shouted over the comm. What's happening? We are a little busy ourselves. When it rains it pours. There are waves of blue mist coming over the river passing through the city, shouted my aide. God damn it. Piet, please tell me that you have your criffing helmet on and your armor is sealed. Yes, sir, he stammered. Good man. I want you to talk with Typho and confirm if the mist is the blue shadow. I switched to another channel. Commodore Palion, I trust that you are monitoring the situation on the ground. All hell is breaking loose over here. I have confirmed release of Blue Shadow at my location and possible one at Theed. On my authority from this moment on, Naboo is under quarantine. You are to deploy your forces as you deem fit in order to enforce it. No one is leaving this world without my permission. I turned my attention to Vindy. As for you, I telekinetically raised him in the air. Where is the antidote? You are mistaken, Jedi. I was hired to revive the virus and make it airborne. There is no cure, he chuckled. I snorted. You are the one mistaken, Doctor. I am no Jedi. I raised my right hand so he could see purple lightning dancing between my fingers. You will tell me everything even if I have to tear it from your mind piece by piece, I hissed. Lighting cracked and Vindy screamed. =RK=. Part 3. Republic Cruiser Requiem. High orbit over Naboo. I gazed at the green planet below us. To my right, Commodore Palion was staring at Naboo with stern expression on his face. Looking at this emerald jewel from here, you would never suspect how grim the situation was on the surface. Theed was in shambles. The city's law enforcement and medical services were swarmed and order was breaking down. According to the latest estimates, about 60% of the population was infected in the first hour after the Blue Shadow was unleashed. By the time people knew what was happening, it was all too late. I shook my head. You'd expect that a capital city in this day and age would have some measures to combat a bio-attack. To be fair, the Naboo people had excellent doctors with state-of-the-art facilities. However, no one had been prepared for an attack of such a scale. To make matters worse, there was no warning either. However, at least for that there was a somewhat decent explanation, not to spook any CIS agents who could have warned the lab. For all the good that did. From my point of view, there were few good news. First, most of the craft which had a reasonable chance to run the blockade were under the control of the local defense forces and were kept under lock and key. For now at least. Second, the general populace actually, mostly, listened when I ordered the quarantine. Which meant that people were getting away from the affected regions and the officials controlling the dams down the river passing through Theed, I probably should have remembered its damn name, were doing their best to close them so the spread of the virus could be slowed down if not contained. The best news was the outcome from my conversation with Palpatine, select senators as well as Yoda and Windu. My thoughts drifted to the chat which took place 5 hours ago. =RK=. Flashback. The holocom sparkled to life with a short hiss of static. 6 blue-tinted figures appeared over the low holographic projector. I nodded at the senators who were introduced to me. Gran Mo, Gran Beniblis, and Bail Organa. Multiple eyes glared hard at me. General Vale, explain your actions. Organa fixed me with a hard stare which I returned calmly. I've been stared down by professionals who had not only the power but the willingness to flay my skin for the fun of it. The good senator's glare was not even remotely impressive. I did what is necessary to ensure the security of your worlds and the Republic as a whole, senators. Would you want to explain to your people why their loved ones are choking to death on the Blue Shadow when a potential galactic pandemic could be stopped easily by blockading one world? It was hard not to sneer at the naive man. Instead, I kept my voice quiet and reasonable. That's not, spluttered Organa. General, what is the situation on the ground? Beniblis' calm voice interrupted him. The virus is spreading towards the eastern swamps. Theed is covered with the stuff after charges containing Blue Shadow were detonated in the river passing through the city. The resulting mist contained both the standard and airborne variants. Before anyone knew what was happening, a significant percentage of the populace was infected. The last estimate I saw was about 50% of Theed's citizens were exposed. It's too early to say how many of them had caught the virus. I've ordered all space flights cancelled and the population outside of the currently affected regions to move further away. It is unclear if there were further attacks on the planet. Isn't this a bit harsh and premature action? Asked Senator Mo. His 3 eye stalks were shifting in agitation. Considering how dangerous this particular bioweapon is, quarantine is the best course of action. Do you want to contemplate what will happen if the Blue Shadows spreads to multiple star systems at a time of a war? Especially while the Separatists are still on the offensive? The GAR is stretched too thin as it is. To make things worse, I do not have the forces necessary to mount an effective blockade of Naboo. If the virus spreads further... I trailed off. There is an extensive underground river network passing through most of Naboo. Sooner or later the whole planet might be contaminated even if their only release points were at Theed and the Sys lab. Grim news, this is, sighed Yoda. Contained this outbreak must be. Chancellor Palpatine, as officer in charge at Naboo, I need orders on how to proceed. I asked. I need instructions in case the Blue Shadow could not be contained at its present locations and threatens to go out of control. What do you suggest, General? Asked Palpatine warily. Permission to draw contingency plans for sterilizing the sites of the outbreak, I said with a straight face. I have not wished to go to such terrible lengths to stop the Blue Shadow from claiming the whole world, but the affected area might have to be incinerated from orbit. This is request I do not make lightly and deeply regret the loss of life that will ensure if it becomes necessary. However, if ordered, I will do so in order to preserve the rest of Naboo and its inhabitants. I lied through my teeth. If it came to it, I was unlikely to lose any sleep over burning large chunks of Naboo. The hit to my reputation, on the other hand, was something I didn't want to deal with. Besides, with Naboo having that weird water networks, it was unlikely anything but sterilizing Theed in the lab in the first minutes after the outbreak could have done a difference. This is madness, shouted Organa and jumped from his seat. He pointed an accusing finger at me. To even contemplate such a thing. What would you have me do, Senator? Let a whole world die from some misguided sense of mercy? I asked while putting as much regret as I could in my voice. There are 5 million souls in Theed and the affected region of the marshes. Over 300 million on the rest of the planet. We are not living in some children's hollow novel with a guaranteed happy ending. This is the real world, senators. Wishful thinking will not save the people of Naboo. I took a deep breath. Bloody politicians. It wasn't like Naboo was some kind of densely populated world. Mere 300 millions, that wasn't even a drop in the bucket. On a large world as Coruscant, you could misplace a few billions at least within the daily population fluctuations. Of course, Naboo did have a few things making it important: location on one of the large trade lanes, the popularity of Amidala in certain circles, and most importantly, it was the Chancellor's own homeworld, which was the most important of the lot. I have the man who created the airborne strain of the virus in custody and interrogated him. He modified the Blue Shadow for easier spread and to be viable for hours out in the air. The only good news is that the death rate is down to about 80% of the people infected with it from the original 98. However, depending on how much of the virus got into a person's bloodstream, the crippling thing could have an incubating period of up to a week without the sick man showing any symptoms. That's another thing we have to thank Vindy about. I do not need to tell you how far someone could travel in such a span of time, all the while they're spreading the virus. I succinctly explained the scope of the problem that dropped in our collective laps. That's a dire news indeed, muttered Windu. He was frowning, and judging by the look in his eyes, the Jedi Master was deep in thought. What about a cure or vaccine? Asked Ben Iblis. Last time I heard from Captain Typho and Theed, they had leads to a possible cure, but I have not received anything more concrete yet. Even if cure is found, it will take some time before it could be manufactured in sufficient quantities and distributed. Not to mention that it will be at least months until all traces of the virus are erased and the quarantine of Naboo could be safely lifted. Vindy hadn't bothered to even attempt creating a cure or research how the Blue Shadow had been largely dealt with in the first place. I had no idea either. It all happened after my accident above Korriban. We need to create a commission which is to investigate what is happening on Naboo, declared Senator Mo. Emperor cursed politicians. The whole mess would be resolved one way or another before some kind of a commission could do a thing. Senator, I chided. This is the same thing you proposed when the Trade Federation invaded Naboo all those years ago. We all know how that endeavor ended. Don't you think that the situation is radically different? What would you do if a shipload of people from Theed reaches your home world? The consequences of those people disembarking in one of your largest spaceports and mingling with the crowds will not be too big a problem, will it? After all, this could not be such important and time-sensitive issue. Not when you suggest that a commission which would take months, perhaps years to do anything, must handle this crisis. Too bad that the inhabitants of Thede would be dead by then. I couldn't help myself. I've never had patience for dealing with politicians. Back in the good old days things were somewhat simpler. At least they were once I had to directly enter the political stage, because by that time I was a powerful Sith in my own right and still had the backing of Barras. That solved a lot of issues. You dare mock me in such a way? The Gran roared. Gentlemen. Enough. Palpatine had to raise his voice to calm down his crony. My apologies, Chancellor. I have a low tolerance for fools who are disconnected from the real world. What are your orders concerning the situation on Naboo? I asked calmly. I'm pretty sure I just made an enemy but found it hard to care. Who had the bright idea of making that imbecile their senator anyway? Maintain the quarantine, General. I will dispatch additional forces to assist you. Find out if there is a cure, and if there is, make all possible efforts to ensure that it is produced and distributed among the infected. Palpatine instructed. Yes, sir. And if the virus could not be contained? I asked innocently. Palpatine looked at the people in his office, then at me. That is to be determined at later date. Carry on your duties, General. Flashback end. =RK equals. To be fair, that went better than expected. Making an enemy from one of Palpy's bootlickers was of no concern to me. The animosity from Bail Organa might be somewhat problematic down the road. I needed the Republic, if I decided to keep it around, to be highly militarized. That however meant that most of the more pacifistic senators would eventually become my political enemies. While that was a problem which I would have to tackle after this war was resolved, I might have to look into opportunities to weaken the peace faction within the Senate, at least some of Palpy's supporters too. Perhaps even the Senate as a whole, in case working with the Republic in the long term didn't prove beneficial. Admiral Yularen's fleet should be here any moment, sir. The bubble of silence that had descended upon us was shattered by Palian's quiet words. Excellent. We are leaving towards Iago as soon as I speak with the good Admiral. Few hours ago, Captain Typho contacted us with not only an update of how bad was the situation on the ground but with the news that they had determined what was the key ingredient of the cure for the Blue Shadow, an extract of Ariska root which could be found only on one place. I recalled that there might be some kind of a trap waiting out there, so I decided to go there with at least Venator cruiser. However, that in turn meant that in order to preserve the thin blockade I needed to wait for Yularen and his ships. A Jedi would have probably rushed there with whatever flying thing he could get their hands on, but that was not the case with me. It's been a very long time since I might have done something equally foolish. I was observing a pair of torrent fighters which were returning from a patrol when big shapes jumped out of hyperspace. The familiar triangular shapes of Republic cruisers and assault ships were a welcome sight. Contact Admiral Yularen's flagship and prepare for hyperjump. Look alive, people. We have work to do. I ordered. A holographic display popped to life in front of the window through which I was looking. That reminded me. As soon as possible I should get myself in a position to influence the warship designs. Who in his right mind put the bridge of a combat ship in a tower over the superstructure? With windows no less? In this day and age there were very few Force adepts who could benefit from such an arrangement. Even back in the day the warships at least had CICs which immediately could take control over the ship if the bridge was taken out. That wasn't exactly the case nowadays. The familiar face of the older man appeared in the display. Admiral Yularen. It's good to see you again. I just hoped it to be under better circumstances. I inclined my head in a greeting. General Vale. Congratulations for the promotion. What is the situation on the planet? Yularen asked gruffly. I gave him a short summary and sent him a full briefing compiled by my officers. Admiral, I have a lead on a possible cure. I'll be taking the Requiem and heading there. I'll leave this mess in your capable hands. He glared at me without much heat. It was obviously that he was not happy that I was dumping this clustercraft in his hands. Tough. Skywalker was still recovering from the wounds received when he saved Ayla Secura, and Kenobi was still on some kind of a mission far away from here. So the famous duo was not here to save the day. I am not too thrilled to leave you in such a situation, Admiral. However, the sooner we have a viable cure the faster this mess could be cleaned up and we can return to winning the war. I smiled apologetically. Yularen shook his head and gave me an exasperated look. It's not like I can order you around. He grumbled. Good luck, General. To you too. I hope that Senator Amidala won't be too troublesome. You are going in search of the cure just to get away from her, aren't you? The Admiral glared at me and frowned. I gave him an innocent smile. I have no idea what you are talking about. You have command over Task Force Requiem. May the Force be with you, I said to Yularan and ordered Palian to get us on the way. =RK=. Nal Hutta. Hut-controlled space. A blue-skinned alien male was sitting on a chair at a corner table with his back to the wall. He was giving evaluating glances to the other patrons of the cantina, which was one of his favorite drinking holes. He sipped from a mug filled with a steaming black beverage and sighed with pleasure. His last job paid an extraordinary good amount of credits, considering that it was an easy grab of a Twi'lek who had tried to desert the SIS with stolen data. The dumb fool was back in the clutches of his former employers, who were very interested in having a heart-to-heart chat with him. Life for the bounty hunter's Bane was good lately, if somewhat boring. He smiled wanly to himself. Bane needed something harder to do in order to get his blood pumping and make him feel alive. After all, despite what most people thought, he was not in this profession just for the money, though it was a nice illusion. Besides, he did appreciate what credits could buy him. A figure cloaked by a black, hooded mantle entered the cantina and scanned its inhabitants. Bane's right hand instinctively felt to the butt of his blaster as he studied the newcomer, who noticed him and headed his way. There was something in the approaching man that made the bounty hunter feel uneasy. Bane, my master has a proposition for you. One that will make you a very rich man, rumbled a digitally distorted voice. The bounty hunter looked at the man under his hat. The stranger had said the magic words. I am all ears. Just don't waste my time. The masked man chuckled. =RK=. Part 4. Republic Cruiser Requiem. Near the world of Thousand Moons. That may be an issue, muttered Palian. He was watching warily the multiple moons, asteroids and the shattered remains of dozens of ships orbiting Iago, which created a veil around the planet. I didn't know that you were such a master of understatement, Commodore. I intoned absent-mindedly. Don't worry, I have no intention of taking the Requiem into that mess. I'll go with a couple of LARTs and a squadron of fighters as escorts. Get a cap running. I hope that whatever had done in those ships is not around. We don't have time for such complications. That's true, sir. My ex-sir agreed. =RK=. Flying through the mess surrounding the planar and its moons was interesting. It was challenging even for me, while I was not relying on the Force to guide my every motion. That gave me new appreciation about the skills of the clone pilots accompanying me. 2 LARTs and 6 fighters were the contingent I was taking down to the planet. The rest of Raider Squadron was on patrol around the Requiem, with the remaining small craft ready to launch at a moment's notice. On the way through the asteroid field, which was filled with shards of destroyed ships, we could see a lot of bodies, belonging to scores of different species, frozen solid in the void. It took us 5 minutes of careful piloting to pass through the ring of debris before we could fly reasonably fast again. I frowned under my sealed helmet. The Force. It was tugging me in a specific direction. This was not the way it usually tried to warn me about something dangerous. The way it felt, it was like an overly eager puppy trying to pull you somewhere and show you something that had caught its interest. I checked the scanners. There was a power reading emanating from that direction. With a shrug, I vectored my craft that way and ordered my troops to follow. After a turbulent descent through the upper layers of the atmosphere, my small force headed towards the heart of a vast city which looked like it was abandoned some time ago. It had a strange feeling about it, a mix of high-tech looking building and ancient ones, with a lot of spires rising kilometers in the air, being a confusing mix from the two. I landed my LART on the platform towards which the Force was guiding me, followed by the second troop transport. The fighters circled lazily above us, ready to pounce at the first sight of trouble. I got out of the cockpit and joined the 20 clones who were already out and securing a perimeter around our transports. Half the clones were carrying blaster carbines, with the rest armed with a mix of heavy weaponry, missile launchers, laser cannons and heavy blasters. "Sir, we are ready," said the sergeant in command of the clone troopers. "Good. Let's." I trailed off. We heard sound of the marching feet of a lot of droids coming towards us, and I congratulated myself for insisting that my men break out the big guns. The clones took what little cover could be found on the landing path and prepared for combat with me in front of them. The fighters were ready to provide air support. Then the clankers appeared from the shadows. B-1 droids marching in a perfect square formation. I could feel a force sensitive approaching from behind them. What was curious was the lack of danger I was sensing. "Is this some kind of a joke?" exclaimed one of my men. It was a sentiment I shared when I took a good look at what was approaching us. Was this some kind of an elaborate trap? Who had the gall to send a bunch of failing apart droids against us? The phalanx of machines were carried the sings of being rebuilt multiple times with whatever spare parts were lying around. One of the B-1 had a left hand of a super battle droid attached to its torso. Many others showed parts which were colored differently from the rest of their bodies, darker or lighter depending on how old they were. The machine leading the procession had its head painted in yellow, showing it was a command model. "Welcome to Iago," they started chanting. "Do we blast the clankers or what?" asked a clone. "It will be a mercy," added another. "Hold your fire," I said while looking warily at the two vulture droids in walker configuration moving behind the square of B-1s. This was getting weirder by the second. I walked to the front of the machines and asked, "To what do we own this reception?" The command droid tilted its head to the left and looked at me. "His Excellency Jabo wants to meet with you." "Is that so? Then by all means lead the way." I made a sign for a squad to follow me, while the rest remained back under the watchful eyes of our air support. Who was this Jabo? I didn't recall anyone important with that name. The machines moved with a precision that showed that their condition was not as bad as it looked like and parted, leaving a way in the middle of their group. I could see behind them that there was a hammock suspended between the legs of the two vultures. A short, red-haired boy was sitting on it and looking at us with interest. "The Jedi are goddamn idiots," I grumbled. I could vaguely recall this scene from a cartoon I watched so long ago back in my original dimension. It was obvious that this Jabo was force-sensitive, and I was equally sure the Jedi didn't take him in for training when they came here for the bloody route. Probably because he was too old. If the kid was really responsible for all these droids, it showed some frighteningly good tech abilities for someone so young and potentially self-taught. Leaving him behind might be an utter waste. I removed my helmet and took a deep breath of cool, clean air. "Hi there." I cheerfully smiled to the boy. He ignored me and glared at the droids to his left. "Ahem." The boy cleared his throat loudly. "Oh. Yes. Roger that." The machine stammered. One of the droids, who was carrying a fan mounted on a pole, began waving it at the kid. Another came near the hammock carrying a tray with dried fruit, and a third, which was made into a walking radio, started fiddling, searching for something decent to play. The kind obviously liked his creature comforts and did his best with the resources available. I could work with this. "This a nice setup you've got here. You have a good taste," I said and nodded towards the wall to the right, which was covered with posters of scantily clad women from different human-like species. "Where did you get the clankers?" I inquired. "The Separatists left a whole warehouse full of the things when they left. It wouldn't do to let poor things rust away, would it?" came the cheeky response. "You erased their memories, probably with a macro protocol, and reprogrammed them to serve you. Not bad for someone so young." I thought aloud. It was one of the more simple ways to do what I was seeing. It still required interfacing directly with each individual machine, but it cut down the time for reprogramming them significantly. It had its downsides, like making the droids much dumber, which was saying something in the case of the B-1s. "Are you a Jedi?" he asked and pointed at my lightsaber, which I had started wearing on my belt. With another I built after finding myself in the future stashed in the secret compartment in my armor. "Nope." "What gave you that idea?" I denied. Jabo snorted in amusement. "Lightsaber and clones who appear to be under your command." He deadpanned. Well, it was a reasonable conclusion. It was a bothersome one too. I was no freaking Jedi. I'd use the Force. However, I am most definitely not a Jedi, kiddo. We are looking for Reeska roots. Do you know where we could find some of those? I patiently explained. Here. There. Everywhere. He shrugged in a disinterested manner and laid back into his hammock. I can pay you to lead us to the roots. Might let you hitch a ride with us back to the civilization if you wish. No use. This system is cursed. Or so they say. No one can leave. The last one to try was a friend of mine. He did not make it far. Jabo frowned sadly. I know what shoots down the ships trying to get away from here. There is a weapon array on one of the moons. I have a cruiser beyond the asteroid field which can make a short work of it once it is located, I said. Jabo's words jogged my memory and I finally recalled what caused that mess in orbit. The kid jumped from his hammock and looked at me carefully. We locked eyes for a few long seconds. You are not joking around, are you? Jabo asked with a trace of hope in his voice. Nope. And my offer still stands. Both of them. Before we left to search for the route, I contacted the Commodore and instructed him to scan the moons for the weapon preventing us from leaving the planet. One way or another that defense system was going down. == The kid led us to a canyon to the east of the city. He pointed us towards a couple of green vines snacking down the cliffs. No climbing down for us boys, I said to the clones and called one of the LARTs. The canyon was more than wide enough for the gunship to fit. I jumped in with a mixed group of heavy armored troopers and clones carrying simple blasters. We flew down following the vines. Couple of brown creatures resembling mutated bats tried to scare the transport from their territory, but few blaster shots discouraged the beasties. It took us only a minute to find a cave opening in which the vines disappeared. Be careful in there. We do not know what may be nesting near the roots, I said and vaulted forward. I landed 10 meters lower on the inside of the dark cave. The clones followed suit and started sweeping the surrounding area. I led the way, and when I was near the place where the vines disappeared in the rocky ground, the floor 15 meters in front of me exploded, revealing a twisted mass of vines and 4 huge jaws of carnivorous plants. Light up that thing, I ordered. We should have brought flamethrowers. The plant screeched when it was hit by multiple blaster bolts. 2 rotatory cannons sliced into it with like a huge saw blades. Pieces of plant matter flew in all directions, as well as drops of green juice which resembled blood. I pulled an incendiary grenade from my belt and threw it at the thrashing flora. It blew up with a subdued whoosh and engulfed the still alive being in blue flames. It let a last, ear-piercing screech before falling down in a burning heap. Huh? So that's why I picked that grenade without even thinking about it back in the armory. My subconscious obviously remembered more about this mess than my waking mind could recall. Weird. The rock to my right exploded, showering me with stone fragments, and from it a pair of green jaws darted towards me. I jumped back away from its path and grabbed the hilt of my weapon. My lightsaber snapped to life and I slashed vertically at the neck of the plant which tried to bite me in half. Its head tumbled away from the thick vine that was its body and fell to the ground, where it continued to snap its jaws in a futile effort to bite something. The sergeant shot it twice with his heavy blaster, burning huge holes in its jaws. It gave a long, piteous hiss and finally laid still. Good work. Be on your guard. There may be more of those things around, I told my people. Thanks to the vines themselves, I could feel life all around us, which was practically identical to the carnivorous plant that tried to eat us. We loaded our backpacks with the precious roots and made our way to the waiting LART. If there were more of those plants in the cave, they decided that discretion was the better part of valor and stayed put. =RK=. We gave Jabo a ride to the landing platform where the other LART waited for us with the remaining clones. I contacted Palion, who had bad news. Thanks to all the junk floating around, Requiem was unable to get conclusive scans of the moons. It was time for Plan B. So you believe you could lift the curse? Jabo bounced on his feet. It's a weapons system. If by lift the curse you mean blowing it up all to hell, then yes. Unfortunately, my ship has a trouble detecting its precise location. We need a bait to find it. I looked at the 2 vultures which were minding their own business. Say, kid, how many of those things do you have operational? And how much for them? I asked cheerfully. A few. What do you have in mind? Jabo bounced on his feet. I smiled at the kid and filled him in on my plan. =RK=. Republic Cruiser Requiem. Near Iegu. Commodore Palion looked over the shoulder of one of his sensor operators. The powerful scanners of the cruiser were barely able to detect the 4 contacts flying fast from the planet. There were simply too many debris which were giving out sensor ghosts. However, there was no way to miss the massive energy surge emanating from the surface of one of the moons. A yellow energy beam jumped from a weapon emplacement on the planetoid and started bouncing from pieces of ships and asteroids. It created an energy net in which the 4 separatists' fighters were shredded. Weapons lock on that location and fire at will, ordered Palion. Huge, twin-linked turbo laser cannons rotated in their mounts and targeted a specific spot on the moon, then fired. Blue bolts of compressed particles lanced through the void, evaporating the junk standing in their path. It took Requiem nearly 3 minutes to blow a hole through the asteroids and debris before its guns could strike straight at the moon. A concentrated salvo from the cruiser broadside hit the place from which the yellow beam emanated. 3 broadsides were more than enough to snuff out of existence the weapon holding the populace of Iago as prisoners. Just in case, Requiem continued to bombard the moon until the side where attack came was a glowing ocean of molten rock. =RK=, unnamed city, Iago. I watched the fireworks with a smirk on my face. Many of the people stranded on this planet were outside watching the light show in orbit. They were talking excitedly when they saw the invisible from here Requiem BDZ, one of the moons. And that's that kid. No more ghost, I declared. I went in front of Jabo, who was looking at the heavens through a binocular. I knelt and floated my lightsaber over the palm of my right hand. That got his attention, and for the moment he forgot the fires in orbit. That's so cool, the kid exclaimed, looking at my hand with huge eyes. Please tell me, Jabo, has some strange things happened around you? Items moving by themselves? Have you felt that sometimes you see things before they happen? I asked him quietly. He looked away from my eyes and muttered something I could not understand. What was that? My lips twitched in amusement. Sometimes when I work on the droids a tool I need floats to my hands, he murmured. It's nothing to worry about, Jabo. That is just a sign that you could use the Force if you receive training. He perked at that and a huge grin appeared on his face. Does that mean that I can become a Jedi? He exclaimed and looked at me with star-filled eyes. I shook my head sadly. That is unlikely. You see, in all their wisdom the Jedi refuse to train anyone who is older than a toddler. The oldest boy I knew that they trained was 9 and they barely agreed to do it. You are how old? 12? 14? I asked carefully. My face was a mask reflecting how sorry I was about the Jedi's foolish policies. I became 13 last month. He grumbled sadly. It's all right, you know. The Jedi are not the only ones who could train you in the Force. I trailed off. You see. I smiled. I had his undivided attention. =RK=, Part 5. Republic Cruiser Requiem. Blockade over Naboo. I watched news reports on what was happening down in Theed on a holodisplay projected on the bridge. Most of the crew here were glancing from their station to see the events unfolding below us. Small news droids were buzzing around the city and catching on camera the tragedy in progress. It was the day after we came back from Iago and the hospitals on Naboo were already busy synthesizing copious amounts of the cure. However, for many people it would be too late. The waterborne strain of the virus killed too fast. Already there were tens of thousands dead, with the number rising fast. The few stasis tanks which were available to the doctors on the planet and whatever the fleet could spare were full, but that barely covered 12,000 people. It was not even a drop in the bucket compared to the millions infected. The most optimistic projections were looking at least 1.5 million dead, with twice that number of people that would take months to recover. Reporters from all over the Republic had a field day. While thanks to the quarantine none were allowed on Naboo in person, that didn't stop them from sending down droids to capture the tragedy in person. I could see images of makeshift hospitals on the streets with GAR and local security personnel attempting to keep the order back to, and almost everything else we could spare could at best alleviate Blue Shadow's symptoms at best. There were lots of people dead either on the streets or in their homes, and right now I could see groups of clones gathering the bodies for disposal. The picture changed to an overcrowded military hospital set up in one of Theed's many parks. There were thousands of people either lying where they could or simply sitting on the ground while medics, soldiers and med droids did what they could, but in too many cases it was too little too late. A mother was carrying the tiny form of her little girl who was covered by large oozing blue spots. She was frantically begging for help, only for a clone to take a look and quick scan, before simply shaking his head. The woman fell to her knees and simply stood there on the ground, clutching her child. Nearby a pair of little boys were shaking the unmoving form of a Zabrak male whose unseeing eyes were turned towards the camera, frozen open in death. The horror show continued on, and that was just Theed. Once upon a time such images would have moved me. Nowadays, I've seen too much horror that made the tragedy on Naboo pale in comparison. Hell, I've caused worse too. All things considered, even when using only conventional weapons, taking a heavily populated world would see much more tragedies than the whole of Naboo had the misfortune to boast. Then there was Crimson, and that horror made every other bioweapon I've seen or heard of inconsequential in comparison. It was a good thing that Crimson was eradicated a couple of decades before I ended in the future. It was a clusterfuck of epic proportions. At least Amidala had calmed somewhat once Skywalker managed to escape from the hospital frigate where he was recovering and made his way to Theed. He was subject of the quarantine for now too, so hopefully Anakin wouldn't be causing any troubles for the foreseeable future. I shut down the holoprojector and looked outside the bridge through one of the windows. I could see a lot of transport ships, which were disgorging hundreds of shuttles chock full with relief supplies and doctors volunteering to help. The most important commodity was coming from the medical ship New Hope, a 2-kilometer-long Titan filled with some of the best medical equipment and doctors in the galaxy. Its shuttles were disgorging 50,000 more stasis pods, which would help save a lot of people. Before the start of the war there were 25 of those mobile hospitals, but they, as well as any other medical assets the Republic used to posses, were primary target for the Sis. Only 10 of the Leviathans were still intact enough to travel through hyperspace. My attention went to the tack pad in my hands. On it a message from the Chancellor's office stared me in the face. In its endless wisdom the Senate had called an emergency session to discuss the events of Naboo. I was to make my way there as soon as the situation on the surface had stabilized and bring Senator Amidala with me. So much for keeping Skywalker and his wife out of trouble. I smirked and called Anakin. It took him a couple of minutes to pick up his comm, and then his hollow image materialized in front of me. General Skywalker, I just received a call from the Chancellor. The Senate is gathering to discuss the situation on Naboo in 3 days. Palpatine suggests that it would be for the best if Senator Amidala makes her case in person. I trust you'll be able to persuade her what is best for Naboo. I valiantly suppressed my amusement. No doubt the good senator would have a lot to say to anyone suggesting she should abandon her people in their hour of need, no matter how good the reason. Better him than me. Anakin apparently shared my thoughts on the matter because he stiffened, and I'm sure he was scowling at me. Is that all, General Vale? Skywalker spoke in a clipped, irritated tone. There's nothing else of note. Good luck. Vale out. I terminated the call. I don't know what he said to his wife, but only a few minutes later I got a brief message indicating they should be leaving Theed within the hour. I returned my attention to the news, though this time I used my datapad to access those feeds. It showed someone high in the Sis ranks. I had no idea who that was or even the species it belonged to. I repeat, no one within the Confederacy of Independent Systems had anything to do with that monstrous deed on Naboo. We are ready to provide all possible humanitarian help to ease the suffering of the people of Naboo. The insectoid continued droning apologies. As if someone was going to believe it. With Vindy in custody and singing like canary, it was a foregone conclusion that the Sis would get all the blame. My issue was that the crazy doctor had no idea who actually released the virus. I made sure he was telling the truth. I did dispatch search parties to scour the areas surrounding the river for kilometers upstream, had other teams checking all cameras within Theed too, along with scouring for witnesses, though the latter was a very long shot. Even if someone saw something, there was no guarantee they lived long enough to share it. As far as I could remember, there wasn't supposed to be such a massive outbreak on Naboo. What Vindy knew supported my fragmented memories. How the hell did my presence cause this mess? What other surprises were waiting for me? I spent a couple of hours pondering those issues without reaching any useful conclusions, then went to check up on Jabo after the Skywalkers were through decontamination and tests to see if they caught the virus. With both of them clean, I ordered Palion to get us on our way and left the bridge. =RK=. I found my apprentice in one of the hangar bays, buried into the mechanic guts of a Lart's engine. Most of said propulsion unit synods were strewn on the deck next to the gunship. I could see 4 technicians around Jabo. They were looking at what he was doing and giving him suggestions on how to fix the craft. The kid was fast becoming the technician's mascot. When I brought him on board the previous day, Jabo had taken a long bath and a warm meal before heading to find something mechanical to tinker with. He had ended in one of the hangars where the mechanics had adopted him like a mascot. My musings were terminated by the arrival of a certain furious senator who stormed towards me with a single-mindedness common for a guided missile. When Amidala was close enough, her right hand snapped in a perfectly executed motion to deliver a slap on my face. I caught her palm in my armored fingers and rolled my eyes at her antics. Senator. You've spoken with your friends on Coruscant, I see. I deadpanned. Behind her scowling face I could see Skywalker hurrying to catch up. He was not too pleased either if his thunderous expression was anything to go by. You wanted to bomb Theed. Amidala screeched in a distinctly unladylike way. I do not think that she ever lost her composure in such a way in either the movies or cartoon. Definitely. If the cure turned out to be a bust and the blue shadow could not be contained, that would have been the prudent course of action, Senator. The last time I checked, you represented the whole world of Naboo and not only the capital. Would you endanger all inhabitants of your homeworld instead of doing what is necessary if the worst happens? I asked her in an even tone. I was honestly curious how would she answer. There are 5 million people in Theed. You'd slaughter them just like that? Asked Anakin with a disgusted expression on his face. If that is what it takes to protect the remaining few 100 million people on the planet, Jedi, what would you do? Watch most of them die? I sneered. He spoke as if 5 million people were too many to be considered expendable, which was a laughable idea. I knew for a fact that there were hundreds of worlds where more people died as collateral damage in this war so far than lived on Naboo. The Council was right about you. You were a heartless monster, spat Anakin. I never denied the monster part. By most reasonable standards I am a monster. I shrugged. Trying to hide it from anyone with even curious knowledge of my past simply wouldn't work. Fortunately or unfortunately for the Republic, I was the kind of monster the Gar needed. Amidala, despite being a senator for years, you are still a naive child. And you, Skywalker. Where is your valued Jedi stoicism right now? The universe does not care for your ideals or good intentions. Neither does the blue shadow. If it is not contained, it will murder between 60 and 80% of all living beings down there. I pointed at the deck and the surface of the world below us. Anakin glared daggers at me. His right hand was clamped around the hilt of his lightsaber. I could see the emotions rampaging through his heart as clear as a day. Frustration, anger, love, and fear. The latest was like a parasite worming its way within the recesses of his heart. It was blinding him. It was obvious that he had no experience with managing his emotions. They were drowning him, leaving him confused and open for manipulation. I had no doubt that as he was right now, Skywalker would be receptive to the lures of the dark side. If I was so inclined, he was ripe for the turning. Tell me, Senator. What would you have me do? Would you watch the virus spreading all over Naboo and choke your paradise of a world? Or if it comes to it, would you have the courage to do what is necessary to save your planet? What about you, Skywalker? How many people must die so you could keep your high moral ground? Please enlighten me. Jedi. They seldom could make the hard decisions necessary during a war or certain types of crisis without compromising themselves. However, those who could bear that burden without high risk of falling were those to watch for and occasionally fear. Right now Anakin certainly wasn't in the latter category. It will never come to that. There is help coming to Naboo from all over the Republic. Even if the virus spreads, we'll be able to save most people. The cure is already in production. Amidala countered. At what cost, Senator? Did you even wonder where all those medical ships were before the current emergency? How many more would be needed if containing Blue Shadow at Theed in the swamps is impossible? How many people across the galaxy will die because necessary medical support is diverted here? The world is not black and white, no matter how much some people try to pretend it's otherwise, I said, looking Anakin in the eyes. Amidala opened her mouth to protest but thought for a moment and snapped it shut. She looked down crestfallen. So she might be aware just how thin the logistics and medical assets of the Republic were stretched. That actually made sense. Padme was famous for her humanitarian missions. That is not something I thought about, muttered Amidala. But when she raised her head to look at me, the fire was back in her eyes. I should have, I admit it. However, that does not change the point. Your cavalier disregard for life goes against all principles the Republic holds dear. Her blazing eyes bored accusingly into me. If looks could kill, and if you were a Sith they just might, I would be a pile of ash scattered across the deck. Tell that to the masses all around the galaxy who are afraid that the virus would escape Naboo and crawl its way to their little corners of the universe. If you want to blame someone for this mess, please target your righteous wrath to the real culprits, the cis agents who created this abomination and later released it. I turned my cold gaze at Skywalker. The aura of fear you are giving out is irritating. Your girlfriend is right here and safe, so chill out. I gave him my best grin. By the way, when is the wedding? Though considering Amidala's mood, I am definitely off the list of invited. Skywalker growled at me and took a step in my direction. Is everything all right, sir? Asked one of the clones who was with Jabo. At least my apprentice looked like he enjoyed the show. I kept my face a blank mask but internally smirked. I could sense the 4 clones and Jabo behind me glaring at the pair. It's all right. We just have a little harmless chat. Isn't that right? I gave my guests a disarming smile, which none of them bought. Anakin shook his head and looked around us. Most of the clones in the hangar had stopped whatever they were doing and were looking at the spectacle with interest. Weren't the Jedi supposed to be calm and composed all the time? Jabo pipped in. You see, my young apprentice, when one of them. I smiled at the kid and pointed at Anakin, is confronted with their feelings, they have no idea how to deal with it. By suppressing their emotions they are caught off guard when, inevitably, their passion breaks to the surface. He is a case in point. You could taste his anger and fear, as well as his love and devotion to the delectable senator. At least she could be sure that his feelings for her are genuine. I smirked at the couple who were doing a great impression of fish thrown out of the water. I could see a rapid succession of embarrassment, mortification and anger passing over their faces, and the emotions I could sense coming from them were even more interesting. =RK=, Part 6. Republic Cruiser Requiem. En route to Coruscant. Oh, get over yourselves. I shook my head at the shocked kids. The only reason the rest of the Jedi are not all over you two is the fact that most of those idiots won't recognize love if it hit them over the head. If they were not too busy pretending that they have no emotions, you would have been found out few days after falling for each other. Skywalker had the good grace to look embarrassed by my words. Everything I told them was true after all. Back on Earth when I watched episodes 2 and 3, it bugged me how those lovebirds could carry on for years under the collective noses of the Jedi. Now, when I had access to the Force, it was mind-boggling. If at least few of the Order members paid any attention, the Skywalker's secret would have been out a week after their marriage. At best. Next thing you'll tell me is that you two have no plans for when the Jedi find out what you've been up to. This was fun. The guilty looks they gave me were answer enough. Splendid. Walk with me, I sighed, doing my best impression of an exasperated parent. I led the stunned couple to the nearest ready room. We found a bunch of pilots who were engaged swapping tall tales, and I banished them to go check the status of their birds while I citing an important Jedi business as the reason. When the last clone exited, I pointed the Skywalkers to a pair of nearby chairs. Sit. And you can natter at me about Naboo later, Senator. For the moment the quarantine is holding, so Theed is reasonably safe from orbital annihilation. Amidala frowned at me but sat down next to her husband. I was ready to bet that if she had not been through hell for the last few days she would not have been so docile. Not that I had anything against it, my patience for politicians, much less the self-righteous sort, had never been high even before I became a Sith. She had spent half the time since my return from Ego helping and reassuring the infected, and the rest by arguing with me, which got irritating fast. You could say that by now I was painfully familiar with her temper and sharp tongue. I summoned a chair and sat down facing them. Jabo, from whom I could feel waves of curiosity, followed suit and watched us with rapt attention. You go back to tinkering, apprentice. If one of those two wants to share the contents of this conversation with you, they will. Scamper. Jabo pouted but complied. Is it really that obvious? Groaned Anakin once we were alone. I smirked at them. Well, you could have made it a bit easier to see by paying for advertisements in rush hour on Coruscant and calling for press conference to confirm it. I trailed off. Seriously, how did the Jedi miss their relationship? It was clear how Sidious figured it out. It was obvious the moment you saw those two together. Skywalker face-palmed. They're going to expel me. He groaned. Throw out one of their better generals in a time of war? Because you've fallen in love? Surely you are exaggerating a bit. If it was a peacetime the council might have considered it, but now? I played the ignorance card. To be fair, I had a hard time believing that the Jedi Masters could do something that dumb. Such a stunt would give me and Palpatine a lot of ammo to use against the council. Not to mention the risk of driving Skywalker right in my open hands. Anakin didn't need to know any of that. His fears could be quite useful if managed properly. They will either throw me out or make me choose between the Order and Padme. Skywalker moaned. Oh, Anakin, muttered Amidala and placed a hand on his shoulder. Am I wrong to presume that won't be too big a setback? I asked. The way those two were looking at each other was making it clear what Skywalker was going to choose. No contest. Are you joking? Grumbled Padme. That will destroy Anakin's life. Being Jedi is who and what he is. Thanks. But I am more concerned what it would do to you. I am sure that the people in the Senate would use that to attack you. Not to mention the reporters. Those vultures would have a field day. Anakin groaned. That was surprising. The Chosen One actually was using his head for a change. And he was right about the circus in which their relationship would be turned by the media. The reporters would have a field day with it. On the other hand, when the secret was out, if the news got handled in the right way, it could become a PR coup for the correct people and unmitigated disaster for the Order. I gave the married couple my best friendly smile. Skywalker, by expelling you from the Order, the Council will do more harm to its credibility than anything else. Anakin, even if the Gar is forced to strip you of command because you could no longer be a Jedi General, I can assure you that by the end of the day there will be a lot of people offering you to accept a commission with equivalent rank. If you accept, that would solve the greatest problem for anyone expelled by the Jedi: no roof over one's head and no income. As you very well know, being a Republic General pays well. Besides, I doubt that your girlfriend will let you stay on the street for even a moment. Of course not, declared Amidala. She had an admirable look of resolve on her face. Skywalker was deep in thought for a few minutes. In that time he was like an open book. I could feel his emotions which would turmoil his heart. Regret that he could be pushed in such a corner. Anger at the unfairness of fate. He felt sorry about the possibility of being separated from his friends and apprentice. He was confused when wondering, what would Kenobi think about him if he was thrown out? There was regret about how his actions might reflect on Ahsoka, and he hoped that his apprentice would understand. But beyond all that was his love about Padme. It was blazing like a beacon. I felt what was in the cauldron of his emotions and had an epiphany. Some of those who had watched the rots in my original dimensions might have wondered why Anakin fell so easy. Many might have thought that his turning to the dark side was because of his love of Padme. That his fall vindicated the Jedi and their code, emotion was to blame. But now, when this young man had his very heart open for all to see, I can tell you that the very reason he would have fallen in that other future was rooted in the Council and their dogma. I knew his emotions. His feelings. Any loyalty Skywalker had towards the Jedi Order as an organization was a pale shadow of what he felt towards individual people. He would go to hell and back for Amidala, Kenobi, Ahsoka and Palpatine, as well as his few other Jedi friends. But if he had to choose between any of them and the Order, there was no contest. The Jedi Masters never understood the heart of this man. They could not. Not while following their own creed. That's where the seeds of their destruction were sown. The Council made it a choice between his wife, unborn children and a man who had been his friend since Skywalker was a kid, and the Jedi as a whole. The young Jedi sitting in front of me could make only one decision in such circumstances. And the Order would always lose. Bloody fools. I watched the turmoil in his heart subduing. Skywalker had calmed down himself. I could sense vines of hope sprouting within his heart. Anakin took a deep breath before grinning impishly at me. You know, I've never thought about it in such a light. I'd hate to be exiled or made to choose between my Padme and being a Jedi, but... He trailed off and gave a fond look to his spouse. If it comes to that, it is the easiest decision that I've ever made. Apparently that was the right thing to say because he was engulfed in a rib-cracking embrace by the senator. Amidala had thrown all thoughts about appropriate behavior and was busy sticking her tongue deep in Anakin's throat. Young love. At least you still got all your clothes on. I smirked. You might want to get yourselves a room. I knew that once Amidala had at least few hours of uninterrupted sleep she would be back to her composed self and likely continued to be a pain in my ass. Back to her much more vocal self too, which would not be an improvement. After days with little to no sleep, stuck into a hazmat suit and watching Theed go to hell thanks to the virus, Padme was not acting exactly as the senator I've met back on Coruscant. Eventually the Skywalkers had to come out for air. After the display, both of them were flushed more scarlet than Shark Tea's skin. Anakin, am I to judge by that slip of the tongue that you two managed to get married already? I asked gleefully. What? No, that's not how it sounds. Skywalker hastily denied. Definitely not. Suddenly Amidala was a perfect picture of affronted indignation. Their immediate reaction to my question was a lot of spluttering denials. I rolled my eyes and waited for them to calm down a bit. Just don't go complaining to me when Kenobi or worse Ahsoka come asking why they were not told earlier. Or invited. I grinned at the couple. Skywalker winced at that. One of these days he'll have a very interesting conversation with his former master. One with a little spitfire that was his apprentice too. He glared at me then smirked. Well, at least I won't be the only one in trouble with the council. Taking an apprentice to restore the Sith, are we? Amidala frowned at that thought. I guess she was not too pleased to have disregarded what Jabbo's presence meant until Anakin spelled it out. I could positively feel her self-recrimination because she had not paid attention to her surroundings when she came to once again accuse me of being an unrepentant monster. Should I be concerned? Asked Anakin. It was obvious he meant Jabbo. I knew what confused him. No trace of the dark side upon the kid, though that shouldn't be surprising at any rate. Even if I intended to train him to be a typical Sith, I did get the kid just yesterday and I've been quite busy since then. Well, I had no need of a typical Darksider, which would be something that would throw a lot of Jedi for a spin in the foreseeable future. I was not going to teach Jabbo much about the darker aspects of the Force until he had the basics up to par and he knew much more about the source of our power and himself. He needed the right mindset to make falling to the dark side unlikely too, and crafting that into him would take time. Perhaps more time than I could spare before the end of the war. About what? I asked innocently. Another Sith trying to cut off pieces from me. Anakin deadpanned. Don't worry. If Jabbo cut something off you I am sure you would deserve it. I smiled at him. Amidala rolled her eyes at us. I'm going to have a chat with the kid, she declared and marched out of the room undoubtedly to begin interrogating Jabbo. I had no illusions that she would soon convince him that it was his idea to tell the pretty lady everything she wanted to know. It was no problem, the kid knew nothing of note anyway. Where did you find him anyway? What do you intend to teach him? Anakin asked. I found him on Iago where I went for the key compound of the cure. It was obvious that he is force sensitive and he wanted to be trained. I believe it's obvious what the council would think about training him as a Jedi. However, now that he is my apprentice they might make an exception and try to get him away from me. I snorted in amusement. Anakin got a faraway look in his eyes and nodded. I was 9 when Qui-Gon brought me in front of the council. They told me I was too old. If it wasn't for Obi-Wan's insistence I would not have been trained either. He admitted. And he is much older than you were, I agreed. I will reserve judgment until I see what you are teaching him. Anakin took a deep breath. You deserve the benefit of the doubt, he sighed. I guess. Skywalker being level-headed and using his brains. That was something that would take some getting used to. A shiver went through the Force. It was the echo heralding that the thread of a possible future had unraveled. Whether that would be for the better or worse remained to be seen. When Padmé finished her chat with Jabbo, Skywalker had to carry her to their quarters. She was too exhausted to walk there by herself. Anakin did not look too good himself. I had to remind myself that he was still recovering from injuries received during his last mission. I would not see them until we exited hyperspace. It did not take premonition to know how they kept themselves busy during the journey. =RK=. I took Jabbo to the mess hall for a light lunch before leading him to a large training room which I had made for my use. It was time to start with his training in earnest. I sat cross-legged on the training mat in the center of the compartment and waved him to follow suit. The Force. It is what gives us our powers. She is our greatest ally. And our most vicious enemy. I began lecturing. I stretched my right arm forward and showed my apprentice an open, empty palm. Watch. I ordered. A mere thought, and with a quiet crack, bluish lightning arched between my fingertips. Wow. That's so cool, Jabbo exclaimed. I chuckled at him. Rule 1 of being a good teacher, make things interesting and keep the attention of your student. Concentrate. Until now you've used this power unconsciously. Feel the Force. It has always been there. Just beyond your grasp. Like a sound you could almost hear. Open your mind and embrace it. Jabo looked at the electricity dancing in the palm of my right hand with hooded eyes. I watched him for nearly an hour while was trying to reach for the force. Then he gasped in wonder. The currents of the force around him changed their direction and flowed through him. I could feel him drawing it in him and smiled. That's it. Good work. I spoke directly into his mind. This is the first step on a hard and wondrous path. He was startled by my words and the force slipped from his grasp. Jabo gave me a proud smile and gasped for air. I had forgotten how much it could take from you the first time you consciously touched the force. Good. Now you must be able to do that without even thinking about it. And keep your connection with the force open indefinitely. == Senator Amidala's office. Senate Building. Coruscant. Once the Requiem reached the capital, I left Jabo on board. There was no need to expose him to the council right now. Dealing with that particular complication would be a distraction at a time when I was about to have an important hearing in front of the whole Senate. That was the reason I was with Amidala and Skywalker in her office. The senator was checking her messages and arranging to speak with few of her allies before the hearing. We needed to know what the real agenda behind this session was. Was it really just meant to discuss the latest separatist atrocity? After resting and coming back to her normal self, Padme was not particularly thrilled with my actions towards Naboo but was ready to at least consider the possibility that I knew what I was talking about. Though she still thought I was a bloodthirsty maniac, now I was one with a tiny bit of hidden depth, something that was a source of unending amusement for her husband and myself. If it was not for this criffing virus we would be resting right now, grumbled Skywalker. We'd be able to leave for some place where no one knows us. Where we could be just husband and wife with no strings attached. Instead, we are stuck here being a senator and a Jedi. You know we can't any, muttered Padme. We have to deal with this and ensure that Naboo receives enough aid. I know, grumbled Anakin. If the Senate wants a scapegoat, we have Vindy in custody. I added my 2 cents. Undoubtedly a big part of today's agenda will be assigning blame. Our work as senators is to serve the Republic, to protect those who could not defend themselves. It is natural that the Senate wants to know how the attack on Theed could happen. Padme continued to be her quite blind idealistic self. Those are laudable ideals. Too bad that outside the core words they do not mean much, I whispered to myself. In fact they didn't mean much in the core either. The door chimed and Bail Organa strode in without waiting for an invitation. Senator Amidala. He saw me and Skywalker and nodded stiffly. Generals. I am sorry to interrupt you but Mon Mothma called a meeting before the hearing. She wants to speak with you, Senator. Bail spoke formally. Asked Senator Organa. Of course. I'll be there shortly. Padme looked back at us. I'll meet you two in the Senate chambers. Try to behave yourselves, she ordered. I'll keep Anakin out of trouble. I smacked at the Jedi who gave me a dirty look. Organa turned to leave and looked back at Padme. Are you coming, Senator? But of course. I'll see you later. When they left, Anakin slumped in a nearby chair. I hate politics, he grumbled. Unfortunately, that's what keeps the world spinning. I commiserated. == GAR headquarters, Coruscant. In the building housing the high command of the Republic's army it was business as usual. Officers, both clones and naturals, were striding in and out of the headquarters doing whatever was needed to keep the army running. From the high-level strategic decisions directing the war to ensuring that the logistics needed for a campaign spanning the whole galaxy were flowing freely. In all this, the droids maintaining the building went on with their jobs mostly unseen beyond some routine scans. On that day the clones responsible for the security of the headquarters were working with faulty equipment though they did not know it. A captain responsible for the maintenance of the scanners had gotten a fat addition to his bank account and helped ensure that 6 droids with some unusual equipment slipped in. Late last night he got on a flight to Scipio and was never seen again. Just like every other day, the machines went on to do the jobs they were programmed for. Most of them did what good cleaning droids would do. A few of the altered ones did the same but only until their internal clocks reached specific time. Then the non-standard circuits came to life for the first and final time. A spark of electricity was sent into a mechanism buried into the torso of each machine. Then 2 things happened. The plating covering their chassis blew outwards in a rain of shrapnel which wounded the people unlucky to be around the droids at the time. Then two spheres housed in the chests of the droids exploded, spreading thick blue gas. One of the robots was working on fixing a faulty computer in the main junction where the ventilation of the building was passing through in order for the air to be filtered. 2 minutes before the rest of its brethren self-immolated, that droid froze for few seconds while a hidden programming kicked in. It proceeded to place 2 canisters full of blue shadow within the heart of the ventilation system before going to a nearby terminal and slicing into it. It would take 2 minutes and 4 seconds by the time the intrusion would be detected. Another minute before it could be stopped, which happened moments before security cut through the sealed door keeping the droid safe. That would prove to be an eternity too late. The droid temporarily disabled the automatic shutdown routines of the ventilation in case a biological or chemical agent was detected in the building. By the time it was turned into slag, blue mist was spreading throughout the whole headquarters. =RK=, Freighter Sea of Tranquility, Coruscant Airspace. Farok Loren was captain of one of the countless trade ships delivering the supplies needed for the survival of a planet turned into one giant, spawning metropolis. At a first glance his craft was nothing to look at twice. The scans it suffered prior to entering the atmosphere showed nothing out of the ordinary, just a small complement of crew and a holds full with droid parts. After that ordeal he had chuckled nervously. He was in. It was time for those Krithing Republic murderers to pay. The Tranquility's cargo was in fact much more sinister than its manifest or any cursory scans could show. In Lauren's opinion, it was great that on surface scan there was now much difference between parts for various robots and deactivated commando droids hidden among those components. The freighter was one of 3 that managed to slip through the Republic's Navy umbrella over the capital. 2 headed for the GAR bases closest to the seat of the Republic's government, and the last flew towards the biggest spaceport nearest to the Senate. Sea of Tranquility veered sharply off its course and headed straight to military base Pella. Its crew, who were handpicked from people whose colonies in the Outer Ring had suffered from mistakes caused by the Republic's forces, disregarded the frantic calls of various controllers and multiple warning about entering restricted airspace. The freighter came in screaming low over the buildings surrounding the target, which it used to take cover from the surface-to-air weapon emplacements planted around the base. By the time fighters were scrambled and reached the descending transport, it was too late for its mission to be stopped. "Raise shields," calmly ordered Lorak. "Head towards that row of warehouses. Blow the underside of the holds the moment we are over the base." The human male smiled contently. Soon he would join his family who were murdered by an accidental orbital strike. As if he was dumb enough to believe it. You do not wipe a peaceful village by mistake. Shields too powerful for a mere freighter snapped to life and absorbed the few volleys the weapon emplacement had time to unleash before the ship was over the base. Pella's own shields were just a heartbeat too late in coming to life, and the freighter slipped through. Its own defensive field held long enough, despite not having enough time to charge to full capacity before coming into fire. The underbelly of the craft was sundered by a series of well-placed charges which opened it, spilling 200 commando droids. Yet, the machines raining all over the base were merely an afterthought. It was the 4 big spheres which detached from the freighter and blew up 500 meters over Pella which were the real danger. Their payload covered the base with blue mist. =RK=, the same scene unfolded over the second military base near the Senate as well as at the nearest spaceport. Farok withdrew a small silver locket from under his shirt and opened it. He smiled contently at the hollow image of his murdered wife and little daughter. He was still looking at their faces when his ship's nose cleaved through the roof of the first warehouse chock full with military equipment. The last act of the freighters attacking the bases was to crash land straight in the motor pools of the military installations. At the spaceport, the transport attacking it was turned into a burning wreck by the guns of an acclimator, which was preparing to launch. Its crew wasted no time, zeroed on the approaching intruder and unleashed all weapons that could bear on the freighter. However, the Republic assault ship was in the atmosphere above a friendly spaceport. It simply couldn't afford to use the full power of its weapons in fear of causing more collateral damage than the incoming freighter could do itself. The firepower aiming upon the approaching ship was not sufficient to fully stop its deadly descent, and it crashed in the command pylons of a defenseless Venator. The resulting explosion crippled the cruiser and waves of blue mist swashed over the spaceport. Moments later, the airwaves over Coruscant were filled with calls of distress and pleas for backup by beleaguered Republic forces. =RK=, Senator Amidala's office, Senate Building, Coruscant. My first clue about the newest mess rearing its ugly head was a tremor in the force. It was a sense of premonition. Skywalker and I looked at each other. Something was about to happen. It was going to be bad. Very bad. I turned my head towards the window. I could see 5 big vehicles, basically flying buses, break from their lanes and head straight towards the Senate. Considering that those were just the ones I could see, there probably were 4 or 5 times more altogether. I jumped from my stool and activated my comm. My intention was to warn the building's security and then call for backup from the nearest military base. I did not believe for a second that what was happening was something harmless like another anti-war protest. My and Anakin's comms came to life before my call could go through. This is General Valentra, identification Besh Delta 3905. Code Midnight. I repeat, code Midnight. GAR headquarters has been hit with bioweapon. Bases Hercule and Pella are under separatist attack and confirm Blue Shadow released in the area. This is not a drill. All GAR units on chorus. The transmission was lost to the characteristic hissing produced by powerful jamming. Skywalker, get your wife and as many of the senators as you can out of the building. I'll try to meet with the Senate Guard and slow down those bastards, I ordered. For once there were no protests from the peanut gallery. =RK=. Republic Cruiser Requiem. High orbit over Coruscant. All GAR units on Coruscant implement plant winter. For few precious seconds Commodore Palian stood frozen by the unbelievable orders coming from GAR headquarters. The sheer audacity displayed by the SIS with attacking targets on Coruscant while simply bypassing was stunning in its sheer audacity. With sheer act of willpower, Palian shook himself out of the stupor and started barking orders. Battle stations. Raise shields and power up weapons. I want all fighters launched yesterday. Assume that this is combined space and ground attack and the SEPs craft the timing until we know better. Find out who is in charge of our forces in system. I want what little ground forces we have on board to be ready for deployment on the surface ASAP. The Commodore turned to Piet, who was still struggling with the sheer impossibility of the situation. Ensign, do whatever you can to contact the General. Move it, people. =RK=. Senator Amidala's office. Senate Building. Coruscant. We just exited Padme's office when the lamps cut off, only to be replaced by subdued red emergency lights. The floor shook lightly when a flying bus struck the building. Then again and again. I counted at least 6 impacts nearby. Skywalker darted along the right corridor, undoubtedly tracking Amidala's force signature. I ran to the left. Before I reached the corner I could hear the subdued sounds of battle. At least for now there were guards who were still alive and fighting. I ran towards the sounds of gunfire and a minute later reached a corridor where one of the doors along the left wall was blown out. A bunch of commando droids were exchanging fire with a dwindling group of men in distinctive blue armor. I vaulted forward and jumped at the backs of the SIS Special Forces. Their first clue that I was amongst their ranks was my lightsaber vertically bisecting a black-colored droid. A reverse strike sliced into a machine to my right while I sent 2 others at the wall on my left with a telekinetic push. Before that pair could recover I picked them up and threw them at their brethren. My intervention raised the morale of the Senate guards, who intensified their fire. Caught from the both sides of the corridor and with no place to take cover or escape, the only thing the droids could do was to perish. Within moments the commandos were dismantled, but not before they managed to gun down 3 more of the blue-armored guards. "Thank you, sir. If it wasn't for you we'd be goners," said an old, gruff NCO who was the senior of the surviving guards. Only 2 of them were left combat effective, with a small group of wounded laying on the floor. "You are welcome. The comms are jammed. Any idea what is the best way to call in the cavalry? If you go to the computer control room there are landlines connected with the nearby GAR bases. Or one of the antenna arrays near the rooftop. You should be able to boost your signal enough to cut through the jamming." "Thanks, Sergeant." I helped them move their wounded to a nearby guard room which had basic medical facilities as well as a lot of guns, while they gave me directions both to the roof and the control room. Considering that I was about to speak in front of the Senate, the only weapons I had on me were my lightsaber and dart launcher. I used the opportunity to take a pair of blaster pistols and few thermal detonators. You could never know when you'd need the firepower. =RK=. Anakin made his way to a parapet overlooking a large room where 70 or 80 senators and their aides were herded in. The men and women were surrounded by 20-odd droids and few mercenaries. Skywalker hissed angrily. A tall man wearing dark brown duster and a large hat which hid his face from the position where the Jedi was, had Padme caught by the chin. He was both proud of her bravery and pissed off because she was endangering herself, again, damn it. She was telling the terrorist that the Senate would not negotiate with such as him, which made him laugh at her. Anakin could sense that the man was amused and had no care in the world. He was either insane or knew something that neither Skywalker nor the senators knew. Padme somehow saw Anakin and their eyes met. The man holding her noticed it and spun around. His weapon moved in a blur and unleashed a hail of laser bolts at Skywalker's cover. The Jedi rolled away from the opening and ran down the corridor. "It's Skywalker. Get him," shouted the terrorist. As he ran, Anakin made another futile effort to raise someone on his comm. "This is useless." He grumbled and turned around a corner only to find himself face to face with a pirate armed with a pistol and a droid carrying a long-barreled blaster. Before either of them could shoot him, Skywalker had his lightsaber in his hands and had it ignited. He deflected their first shots at the walls and then the man fell slowly to the ground with most of his brain and the back of his head missing. The droid was made by a sterner stuff because few deflected shots did little to slow it down. That prompted Anakin to advance towards the machine. With an economic slash he cut the barrel of the droid's gun and with the backstroke took off its hands. The machine's distressed whine was cut off by a blue laser blade applied to its head. == Chancellor's Office, Senate Building, Coruscant. "Sorry for disturbing you, Chancellor," said a holographic figure that was projected in the center of Palpatine's cabinet. Judging by the smugness in his voice, the man did not regret it at all. "I already have control of the eastern part of your building and 50-odd senators. I will soon have most of the Senate in my grip. If you care about your senators, I advise you to release Count Dooku and General Grievous." Palpatine frowned. "You know that the Republic does not bow down to terrorists. No deals. What just happened to two of your nearby bases should be an object lesson about my abilities. If my demands are not met, I will release Blue Shadow not only in the Senate but across Coruscant." Palpatine stood still at hearing that. Getting the virus released around the planet was not part of his plans. He narrowed his eyes dangerously at the mercenary crisis. Part 1. Senate Building, Coruscant. My hopes to find more alive Senate guards were dashed when I reached the main guard station for the eastern part of the building. Its door was blowout and over its twister remain laid the body of a man clad in scorched blue armor. I did not need to be clairvoyant to figure out what had happened to most of the guards. The stench and smoke coming from the room were more than enough. When I glanced inside, I could see pieces of men and armor splattered all over the walls and ceiling. Most of it burned beyond recognition. It looked like a thermal detonator had blown up in the midst of about 20 to 30 people. It was not a pretty sight. The smell was even worse. So much for that plan. It was time for improvisation. And calling in a couple of thousands clones to clean up the mess. If I was lucky and Palpatine was sealed in the Senate, that would give me few interesting options. But I had a decision to make first. Getting out of the Senate and calling in the cavalry will give me free rein to deal with the situation. With the GAR headquarters and the nearby bases hit, I was one of the highest-ranking officers on Coruscant who could take command of the situation. On the other hand, once I left, getting back in could prove problematic. That is if I cared about the welfare of the hostages. However, the only value most of them had was as obstacles to Palpy getting even more power. Decisions. Skywalker found himself near the rooms where the mainframe of the Senate was located. The door leading to the computer complex slid open and a short, bluish alien sauntered out. The being gave one glance at the Jedi, screeched and darted back inside. Anakin ran towards the door and hit the button to open it with his fists. It beeped angrily, but the entrance remained barred. He shrugged and activated his lightsaber. Whatever that fella was doing there was not good. He was about to slice open the door when he heard someone approaching. The Jedi turned around and groaned. 12 commando droids had sneaked up to him and 2 of the mercenaries were approaching from the far ends of the corridor. One was a Wookiee male armed with a pistol and the other a woman who looked human. She had a sniper rifle levered at him. "Damn," grumbled Anakin. As if his words were a signal, the droids opened fire. He had trouble holding his ground under the onslaught. Skywalker deflected most of the blaster bolts and barely moved from the way of the others. The fact that the commandos were made from better materials than your run-of-the-mill clankers did not help him. In order to disable one of the robots, he had to deflect 2 or 3 blaster shots in the same area of the damn machines. Anakin knew that he could not stay at his present position for long. It would take only a single lucky hit or another group of droids showing and he'll be in real trouble. The Jedi concentrated and blasted the commandos with a telekinetic wave which threw them off their feet. Only the Wookiee and the sniper, who were staying back, remained standing. Skywalker deflected few shots at the man who flew backwards when they connected with his body. Before Anakin could dart in, the opening he had created, the door behind him slid open and he felt imminent danger. The Jedi tried to move away but was stopped by few well-placed sniper shots which he was forced to deflect. Before he could react, the small being had jumped on his back and struck him in the neck with something. Skywalker's world exploded with agony. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a yellow glow. =RK=. Palpatine glared at the image of the smug bounty hunter suspended over his desk. He was in a bind. He could feel a bunch of droids trying to cut their way in his outer offices. While the fact that most of the senators were hostages was something he could use, Sidious could not permit himself to be caught. That could easily force him in a situation where he must show his powers, something he was not ready to reveal. The easiest way to avoid that would be for him to cave under the demands of that arrogant bastard. The downside of such an action was that he'll miss a golden opportunity to dispose of some of his most vocal opponent. Well, he could always spin it in a way as him doing his best to placate the terrorists because of the bioweapon and pretend that he was waiting for the GAR to deal with the issue. Sidious frowned. He despised when one of his plans went awry. And in such a spectacular manner. Senator Taff will carry the necessary papers to the prison where Grievous is held. I am afraid that the Jedi will be most reluctant to release Dooku. Leave them to me, sneered Bane. Just sent your friend to take the general. =RK=. These days I was supposed to be a general, not a common grunt, so I decided to act like it. I cut my way through the door of one of the thousands offices spread around the building and made my way through the devoid of life rooms. The thick window which stood in my way of getting shattered when I sliced through it. I frowned at that. I always thought that what happened during the battle between Sidious and Windu in Episode 3 was either done for a dramatic effect. You'd think that the windows in the Senate building would be made from a sterner stuff. Another point for the lowest bidder, I guess. Some things apparently were the same no matter in which universe you were. I slid down the curved surface of the building and in the last moment jumped off it. After few seconds of free fall I landed on the hull of a freighter that was parked on one of the docking slips of the Senate. That gave me a nice view of a droid manhandling a big blue alien man into a speeder. The man was wearing an expensive-looking robes. A senator, I think. I frowned. There were a lot of things wrong with that picture. I hurried down from my vantage point and jumped into a red, two-seat air car. I sent a bolt of lightning at its onboard computer and used my powers to force start its engine. Then I sped after the robot and the man it was holding hostage while checking my comm every few seconds. Few minutes later I flew out of the jamming field and grinned. It was showtime. This is General Vale. Commodore Palion report. I spoke into my comm. =RK=. Republic cruiser Requiem, high orbit over Coruscant. The bridge crew released a collective sigh of relief when they heard the general's voice. None more than Gilad, who was getting sick from dealing with Rear Admiral Borave Quid, the man who had taken command of the Navy units over the capital after the start of the emergency. How the fool had reached such a rank, the Commodore would never know. The man had refused to allow any troops from the fleet to be sent to the planet, which meant that with the virtual neutralization of the bases near the Senate, both installations were hugged under their theater shields in an attempt to stem the spread of the bioweapon. The nearest ground ponders that could arrive at the scene of the attacks in force were hours away. But the Rear Admiral was afraid to do anything without orders from the HQ. The same high command that was sealed after a bio-attack and under heavy jamming preventing communications. So when the general had contacted them, Palion was glad. Technically Vale outranked that toad Quid. The question was if the Admiral would, and most importantly his subordinates would agree. The Commodore hurried to give sitrep to his commander, for all it was worth considering how little hard information they got. Criffing bastards. Cursed Vale. Those attacks were only distractions. There was an attack on the Senate. Most of the building is under enemy control. I can confirm that there are dozens and perhaps hundreds commando droids crawling all over the building. Assume that the Chancellor and all senators in there are either dead or under duress. Who is in charge of this clusterfuck? Rear Admiral Quid. Deadpanned Pallion. And as far as we can determine, there is no one in command down there. The comms are either jammed or down due to quarantine procedures by the Force. That at least explains the lack of reaction from GAR units. Listen, Commodore. I am taking command of the situation on the ground. I want you to launch all ground forces you have on board. I want 2 LARTs to vector on my signal and send the others to establish a perimeter around the Senate building. And contact Quid. I want ground forces deployed to contain the situation within the hour. If the idiot gives you any problems, patch him to me. Gladly, sir. =RK=. Secret prison, Coruscant. I could see the senator and his captor preparing to land on a platform where at least a dozen armed clones were waiting for them. So Palpy had decided to play fast and get his pawns out of custody while he still could. I snorted with amusement. Whoever was held at this facility was not going anywhere. I sped up and pointed the air car I had borrowed at the ride which the robot and its captive had used. That had the additional benefit of giving me a nice view of what was happening on the platform. A door in its far end opened and 4 clones came out. They were escorting a sled filled with clear liquid in which the crippled body of Grievous was floating. I was glad that the Republic intelligence folks were not dumb enough to rebuild that menace. Not that it would have helped the tin can, given the circumstances. I vaulted out of the car moments before it smashed into the vehicle which my targets used to came here. The sheer kinetic strike sent both craft spinning under the platform where they smashed in the side of the building and exploded. While I was still in the air, I drew my lightsaber and delivered a diagonal slash. I landed lightly on the platform and smiled at the clones who had their blasters trailed on me. I deactivated my weapon and glanced at the droid in front of me. It tried to turn its head towards me, but that little motion was enough to make it understand that it was finished. The upper part of its torso slid to the ground with metallic clatter. "Stand down, men," I ordered. My words were given more weight by the 2 LARTs which dropped from the sky and floated over the platform. Their side doors opened and they disgorged 71st Platoon. I walked between the 2 lines of clones who had snapped to attention after a hissed command from their officer. I stopped in front of the container in which Grievous was floating and beamed when I saw that he was awake and was glaring at me. "No, my tin friend. You are not leaving so easy. It would be a most impolite thing to do." I turned to the clone officer. "Commander, get that thing back to his cell and lock down this facility. There is still a possibility of separatist attack." "Understood, General. I'll see to it at once, sir." I went to the senator and all traces of humor disappeared from my face. "And take this fellow into custody. He was either under duress or he is a criffing traitor. When we deal with this mess, we'll have to figure out which." I left the spluttering senator for the clones to handle and headed to the nearest LART. I waited for my men to board when my comm hissed to life. "This is Commander Rex. The Jedi Temple is under attack. We need reinforcements." I shook my head. So much for canon events. Perhaps it was a good thing that I remembered very few things about the Clone Wars era, so I won't be lulled in a false sense of security by future knowledge I might take for granted. I was sure that there was no attack on the temple in this period until Order 66 was called, and if that was the case, it would not be a clone calling in for reinforcements to help the Jedi. I glanced in the direction of the Senate and then to where I thought the temple lied. With which mess should I deal first? I wondered before jumping in the LART. =RK=. Part 2. Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Padawan Ahsoka Tano was cooling her heels in her small room in the temple. Apparently the time she had spent in the presence of Dulcatar was deemed a bad thing and she was put under intense scrutiny. She was in what amounted to a house arrest as a result. But that was not the worst. Many of the older Jedi and even a significant number of her friends were giving her wary glances when they thought she was not looking at them. It was frustrating. What did she do wrong? It's not like she had become a murdering Sith like Dooku or that skank Ventress. But did the other Jedi see it that way? "It's not fair," she grumbled quietly. She jumped from the small bed on which she was sitting cross-legged in a futile attempt to meditate. She simply could not clear her mind and concentrate. It was supposed to be simple. Just stuff all your emotions in a tiny mental box, lock it up and throw away the key. And the box while you were at it. Well, it did not work. Tano started pacing around her room. She was exhausted by the unspoken accusations. Even since Anakin had run away to Naboo where the damn clankers had released a bioweapon, of all things she was left alone in the temple. Her ordeal had started innocently enough, a strange look here, a whispered word there. Then she was summoned in front of the council where they interrogated her in excruciating detail about every second she had spent near Del-Qatar. When she had refuted their thinly veiled claims that he was trying to turn her into a Sith, Ahsoka could sense that most of the masters did not believe her. Interestingly enough, with the notable exception of Master Windu, none of those who were vying for Del-Qatar's blood had even spoken to the man. By what she could gather from their questions, they had no evidence that he had done anything wrong. In the past 3,600-odd years at least, what she had overheard from his conversation with Master T did not really count, right? Ahsoka would be the first to claim that torturing those ancient Jedi was anything but acceptable. However, if anyone had something approaching a just reason for such action, it surely was Vale. She shook her head ruefully. Won't this madness end at last? Her brooding was interrupted by the chiming of the doorbell. Ahsoka looked at the entrance to her humble home and smiled. She could sense Rex outside. The Padawan hurried to open the door and grinned at the clone who was wearing his armor sans helmet. The man was looking at her with amused expression on his face. Commander Tano, I am bringing you requests from Generals Skywalker and Vale to attend the Senate hearing which will be held this afternoon. I am here to escort you to the visitors' chambers of the Senate, he declared in a calm, professional tone. At hearing that, her face was stretched by a huge grin. She summoned her lightsaber, which was resting on a table near her bed, and eagerly nodded at the clone. By all means, Commander. Lead the way. Rex gave her a very proper salute, spun on the soles of his feet and marched down the corridor as if he was on parade. Ahsoka followed suit. She carefully wiped the grin from her face and did the best she could to give herself an outwards appearance of serenity. She wondered what stunt Del-Qatar was trying to pull off this time. Minute later, both of them heard a frantic call from a Republic general on Rex's comm. They looked at each other and ran down the corridor. They reached the huge hall leading to the main entrance of the temple, and Tano heard the roar of forced engines. She looked at the huge, half-closed doors and saw 3 shuttles heading straight towards the opening. She stared in the approaching ships with disbelief. The few Padawan and Jedi Knights in the huge hall mirrored her reaction. This was the Jedi Temple. No one dared attack it ever since the sack of Coruscant. Ahsoka was still staring at the onrushing doom when Rex turned around, grabbed her across the waist and picked her up as if she was a little girl. The trooper ran to the closest row of columns lining the hall and used one of them as a cover. He was just in time because a missile flew through the open doors and slammed in the ground nearby. The blast waved threw them off their feet under a rain of smoking pieces of marble. The commander acted on instinct and grabbed Ahsoka again. He dragged her away to another column. The entry hall shook when the first shuttle battered its way through the gates. Its wings were sheared off, but its main body remained intact and it crash-landed on the floor. The craft was deadly wounded. It would never fly again on its own, but it did its intended purpose. Its passenger survived the crash, and the moment the shuttle stopped scrapping along, the ground ramps on its sides opened. Its 2 companions used the hole it battered to fly in mostly intact. They slammed into the ground further along the long hall. A dazzled Ahsoka could see a young Padawan, no more than 12, running towards an older Jedi who was laying bleeding on the floor near the first craft. The human girl looked up at the shuttle and gasped. Her hand scrambled to grab her lightsaber and yellow blade came to life. She managed to deflect the first 6 blaster bolts which splashed harmlessly on the armored bulk of the shuttle before a shot slipped through her defense and pierced her right shoulder. She shouted in pain and her arm dropped uselessly. The young girl had a moment of horrified realization before she was torn apart by a hail of blaster fire. Rex scrambled to his feet and activated the comm built in his left arm guard. He asked for help but did not hold much hope for reinforcements arriving anytime soon. With the bases around the Senate attacked, it was clear where the bulk of the Republic forces on the planet would be heading. He glared at a commander droid which jumped from the first shuttle to crash into the temple. The machine raised its weapon and shot the bleeding Jedi multiple times. The commander drew his pistols and took aim but held his fire. More clankers were exiting the wrecked shuttle. Amongst the machines were 2 figures wearing black cloaks. One male and the other female, judging by the curves of their armors. Those 2 activated blood-red lightsabers and looked up. 6 masked Jedi wearing light brown robes and light armor underneath jumped in front of the droids and their leaders. Each of the Order members had a saber staff which when activated revealed short yellow blades. As if that was their cue, 11 more droids exited the shuttle. They had grey cloaks slung over their right shoulders and force staffs in their arms. The ends of their weapons sparkled wickedly with purple energy. Beside Rex, Ahsoka shook off the after effects of the explosion that stunned her and jumped on her feet. She activated her lightsaber and moved to join the temple guards, but the commander grabbed her left hand and shook his head. He pointed at the other 2 shuttles which had disgorged much more droids and another 5 men and women brandishing crimson lightsabers. == Jedi Temple holding cells, Coruscant. Count Dooku allowed himself a small smile when he heard the subdued sounds of explosions. He knew that his master and the Sis won't leave him to rot in the Jedi's clutches. Despite the ancient shackles dampening his power, the former Jedi retained connection to the Force that was strong enough for him to sense what was happening beyond the door of his cell. The surprise of the 2 temple guards who were lounging behind the armored door was a profound source of amusement for him. The taste of their stunned disbelief was like a sip of well-seasoned wine. "It's about time," he muttered when his sensitive hearing detected the approaching whoosh of rocket engines. That was followed by the snap hiss of activating lightsabers and rapid blaster fire. Dooku's cell shook and the one-armed man had to struggle to remain sitting on the hard bed. He shook his head in an attempt to banish the ringing in his ears caused by the 5 explosions which rumbled along the corridor where his cell was located. The Sith could sense the death of one of his prison guards and the agony racking the other one. That was ended a moment later and he could feel a familiar presence on the other side of the door. So his acolytes came to his aid. A minute was spent in silence while the armored door glowed orange and started melting. It was time to leave the Jedi's dubious hospitality. == On the other side of the temple and few hundred meters down was another cell where Asajj Ventress was stuck. Needless to say the young woman was bored out of her mind. The interrogation attempts of the Jedi were bloody useless, but at least they were her one source of entertainment. But for more than a week she was left alone with no contact if you discount the opening of a small slit in the door barring her way out from where her meals were delivered. She had to admit that boredom was a better method to force her into revealing information than the sessions she had with the Jedi. Their pathetic attempts to bring her to the light were laughable. Cast off the dark side? And for what? To become an emotionless drone? She scoffed at the very thought. Ventress was in the middle of her daily training regimen, the only thing with which she could fill up her time while stuck in that bland cell when she felt the floor shaking lightly. It was not an earthquake. Not on Coruscant. She grinned like a hungry predator who had just smelled freshly spilled blood. Suddenly Ventress found herself on the floor when the corridor outside was engulfed by the edge of a massive explosion. She groaned and spit a mouthful of blood. Asajj had managed to bit the inside of her cheek when she fell. She coughed from the dust that was filling her room and blinked at the door. Something was hissing and burning the armor. Her boredom was at its end. == Large gunship, Nero's Secret Republic prison, Coruscant. My mind was made up when I felt sudden shock and pain from a weak connection through the Force I did not knew had formed. I could sense the distant presence of Ahsoka from the direction of the Jedi Temple. She was hurt and in danger. Bloody hell. That was a complication that I did not need. Besides, I already got an apprentice and she was a bit too young for my tastes to consider her as anything else. Besides a friend. That thought froze me. It's been a long time since Vale had someone who he trusted enough to give such a title. And no matter how much I might have wanted to deny it, I had merged with the echo of the man. His memories, his past, they were mine too. They were as real to me as my own. I winced. If anyone ever tries to tell you that the Force comes without a lot of strings attached, they are shameless liars. I called to the pilots. Head towards the Jedi Temple. I turned my attention to the clones who were in the troop compartment with me. Prepare for battle. I doubt that whoever attacked the temple has come with something less than what they deem sufficient numbers to at least hold off a lot of Jedi for some time. What left unsaid was that if that was anything more than a raid, the enemy would most likely have enough troops deployed there to make our contribution irrelevant. But I deemed such an outcome unlikely. The fact that whoever was orchestrating these attacks had tried to have Grievous released meant that the most likely target was the rescue of Dooku and perhaps Ventress. I activated my comm and called for any forces which were not busy cordoning the Senate to head towards the temple. Don't get me wrong, A bunch of Jedi getting themselves a real taste of war and getting killed in the process was not something awful in my books. But I had an image to create and uphold. When the time to face off with the Jedi Council came, I wanted to have the moral high ground amongst other things. Me coming to their rescue would be remembered by the Jedi who were not too far gone thanks to the Order's indoctrination. Besides, I did like the kid. It would be a damn waste if Ahsoka got herself killed. =RK=, Part 3. Great Hall, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Rex was trying to pull back Ahsoka, who was grimly standing her ground. That delay let them have a front row view of the fate of the 6 guards. The commander droids ignored the Jedi and moved away, leaving them to their melee-armed comrades and the pair of organics with lightsabers of their own. First to attack were the 11 Magna Guards, who charged the Jedi with their staffs spinning in tight circles around their bodies. They were closely followed by the 2 Force wielders who reeked of the dark side. That skirmish was short and vicious. For the first few seconds the 6 men held their ground by working as a team. The wave of droids literally bounced from a wall of lightsabers, leaving one of their numbers on the ground in a smoking heap. Yet that was only a probing attack. What followed was an all-out charge which was about to overwhelm the Jedi. The 2 guards in the center of their line used the Force to push away 6 of their foes. That, however, bought them just a moment. The droids fled back only a couple of meters before being stopped in midair and hurled back at the Jedi. The 2 Dark Acolytes had waited for something similar to happen before engaging in combat. This surprised the Jedi, who were caught off position in an attempt to overwhelm the remaining robots. That's when the droids slammed into them, Force staffs first. One unfortunate man landed on the ground hard with 3 of the machines on top of him. Before he could recover, one of the robots grabbed his head in its metal fingers and twisted. The Jedi's corpse convulsed once and laid still. Another was a bit luckier, if such a term could be used for a Force user. He managed to interpose his weapon between himself and the 2 droids which hit him. He hissed in pain when the sparkling tip of a Force staff connected with his left thigh. However, that was a small price to pay. The droid that hit him on the right side ran headfirst into his blazing blade. That was one clanker that wouldn't bother anyone again. The second one tried to use its machine strength to overpower the Jedi, but ended being thrown in the air and met a whirling of yellow blades when it fell. The last of those 3 Jedi managed to slice through the waist the droid that collided with him, but not before his face was struck by a staff. His mask shattered, revealing a middle-aged human man who was knocked unconscious. The other 3 temple guards were not that lucky. The man on the left flank of their original line found himself facing 4 Magna Guards who fell on him like berserk, uncaring for their own safety. He exchanged a flurry of blows with them while failing back from their unrelenting assault. 2 of the droid attacked him simultaneously from both sides. He managed to interpose the blades of his saber staff between their weapons, but that pinned him down for a moment. A third of the elite robots landed a crushing blow in the middle of his weapon, shattering both its emitters and the Jedi's right hand. The man's pain scream was cut short by multiple bone-breaking blows from the other 3 droids. On the right flank, the other 2 Jedi had it much easier. For about 5 seconds. In that time they were facing a single droid each. The temple guards knew that only seconds remained before additional enemies engaged them, so they went on the offensive. That caught the droids by surprise and they were forced back under an unrelenting assault. One of the Magna Guards was not fast enough to reposition his staff to parry a diagonal slash, and his staff was sliced in 2. That was followed with a short upward cut which melted through the lower torso of the machine. While not immediately disabling, the damage slowed it down considerably, and the Jedi took the opportunity to cut it to pieces with few precise attacks. His partner was still busy with the other droid when the 2 acolytes chose to attack. They darted from both sides of the robot and struck simultaneously. The temple guard managed to throw away the droid with a force push and met the attack from the right with one of his blades, but was not fast enough to intercept the slash from the woman on his left side. He grunted when her crimson saber cut a fiery line through his chest. His legs refused to support his weight and he fell to his knees. He saw a flash of red and the world rolled madly. The Jedi blinked in confusion at a kneeling headless body before his eyes closed for one last time. Meanwhile, Ahsoka was slowly stepping back under the onslaught of multiple commander droids who were shooting rapidly at her. Behind her, Rex was returning the favor with his 2 pistols. They watched helplessly how the temple guards were taken out one after another. It was worse for the Padawan, who could feel them dying through the Force. And they were not alone. Of the 30-odd Padawan and knights in the hall prior to the beginning of the assault, only 8 were still alive. The Magna Guards concentrated on the Jedi that had taken out 2 of their numbers while the Acolytes attacked the last of the Temple Guards. Both battles were over within the seconds. The man facing the droids was simply buried under an avalanche of swinging Force staffs. The Jedi attacked by his dark counterpart fared a bit better. He was retreating under a rain of slashes and jabs expertly delivered by his opponents until the woman used the Force to pull him towards her. He tried to counter her technique, but to his horror found out that he was simply not strong enough. She sidestepped a desperate attempt by the Jedi to impale her and surged forward. She cut off the left hand of the man at the elbow and sent his staff flying away. In the next moment her fellow acolyte finished the Jedi by plunging his scarlet blade in his chest. == Council Chambers, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Both Yoda and Windu, the only 2 Jedi Masters currently on the planet, had made their way to the Council Chambers when they felt a strong disturbance in the Force. Unfortunately, their sight of the future was even worse than usual, so they did not know what to expect besides being aware that it would be bad. For all their experience and supposed wisdom, or perhaps because of it, neither of them could have imagined what was happening. They stared at a hollow image from a security camera showing the Great Hall. What prompted them to check what was happening there? Was the barely heard sound of explosions and, even worse, the Jedi deaths they felt? "Dark day this is," muttered Yoda. He had a sad frown on his face and his ears had drooped in a sign of regret. "Distraction this is," he said. Windu nodded. They both sensed Jedi dying from both east and west sides of the temple, far from the site of the main attack. But where their Sith prisoners were held. "I'll go after Dooku. Undoubtedly he is their real target." "That you must. Greet our uninvited guests." "I should." Before they left towards their targets, they called the younglings caretakers and ordered them to take the children deeper in the temple where they should be reasonably secure, as well as ordered additional guards sent to protect them as well as the archives. All other combat-ready Jedi were ordered to converge upon the Great Hall. The Jedi Masters ran in different directions. One who did not know better would be surprised at how fast Yoda moved, by jumping from the floor and walls more often than not. == Great Hall, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. If it was not for the Jedi Knights and Padawan joining the battle in constantly increasing numbers, Ahsoka doubted that she or Rex would have lasted much longer. The clone commander was taking cover behind a column and she was holding her ground in front of him, facing a semicircle of commando droids who were trying to shoot them to pieces with mechanical precision. "Hey, Ahsoka!" exclaimed a voice which was all too cheerful considering the circumstances. A short Mirialan woman sprinted from a side passage and joined Tano in deflecting the storm of blaster bolts. Her midnight blue robes were a stark contrast with the lighter colors that most Jedi preferred to wear. "You know me, Beres. It appears that trouble finds me no matter where I am," Ahsoka chuckled despite their situation, which had become grimmer. The 2 dark acolytes noticed them and headed their way. The only silver lining was that the commandos decided to go search for other prey, but the remaining Magna Guards from the first shuttle moved their way. "This is going to be unpleasant." "You think?" asked a new, male voice. The Padawan glanced behind and grinned at the young Mon Calamari male who had joined them. Nadaveb gave the girls a rueful smile and activated his blue lightsaber. The new Jedi Knight, he had been promoted mere weeks ago, did looked with disapproval with the 6 droids marching towards them and their dark masters. The sheer audacity of those cis people frustrated him. They had the sheer gall to attack the Jedi Temple itself. The Jedi Knight strode forward and took position between the Padawan. == Part 4. Holding Cells, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. The melted remains of the armored door-barring Dooku's cell were hauled out with the Force, and the aging Sith saw a brown-skinned Zabrak woman on the other side. She gave him once-over and looked him in the eyes critically. "Kadrian. It's nice to see you again." The woman bowed to her master and walked towards him. He waved with the stump of his left arm at the metal belt to which his remaining hand was chained, and his part-time bodyguard cut through his bindings with her blade. Dooku stood up and stretched. Once the artifact binding his powers was sliced open, he could again bathe in the full presence of the Force. Suddenly he looked a decade younger. Kadrian retrieved a curved lightsaber from her belt and respectfully presented it to his master, who gave her an approving nod and retrieved the weapon. It was one of his spare sabers which he kept in his various strongholds.
We need to leave, Master.
Unfortunately, we do not have the forces at hand to deal with the Jedi today.
Indeed. We'll have our vengeance another day.
They hurried away escorted by 4 bounty hunters wearing Mandalorian-style armors and 2 squads of commando droids. However, when they exited the prison wing, the separatists ran headlong into a single man. The vanguard, which consisted by 6 droids, opened fire. Their shots were intercepted by purple lightsaber blade which reflected them back at them. The man threw his cloak at a pair of the commandos, obscuring their vision for a moment. He moved much faster than a human should be able to and cut off the heads of 2 machines with single sweeping strike. The Jedi used telekinesis to hurl another pair at nearby wall, from which they bounced with god-awful clatter. In the next moment he was upon the last 2 droids which were still trying to shoot him. He deflected a blaster bolt at the weapon of the one that was further away and slashed through the chest of the closer robot. He pulled the second one to him and impaled it on his saber. The Jedi discarded the destroyed droid and turned to the Sith and his acolyte.
Count Dooku.
The black man hissed the Sith's name.
You won't escape.
Is that so, Master Windu? Your anger is plain for all to see. That's not the Jedi way, is it? Taunted Dooku. The Count and Say activated their crimson blades and charged the Jedi Master. =RK= East Ballroom, Senate Building, Coruscant. Anakin came back to the land of the living feeling cramps all over his body. He blinked owlishly, trying to figure out where he was. On the bright side, he found out that his head was in Padmé's lap. That was the only good news. He looked around and saw a bunch of senators with few aides. They were all gathered in the center of a large, round room. Around them he could see a cage made of visible laser beams which emanated from charges placed on the walls around them. What did I miss? He quipped at his wife, who looked at him with relief in her eyes. That your Chancellor does not value your lives. Bane deadpanned. The bounty hunter had tried to contact the droid he sent to retrieve Grievous, but for the last few minutes that was unsuccessful. He drew one of his blaster pistols and shot a couple of senators in the head. The rest of the politicians huddled together like a herd of scared cattle. All but that pretty senator from Naboo who was tending to Skywalker. Bane smirked and aimed his gun between the woman's eyes. The Jedi jumped on his feet and shielded her with his body. Bane's hand twitched and he pressed the trigger. Anakin, shouted Padmé. =RK=. Lart en route to the Jedi Temple/Great Hall, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. We were minutes away from the battle and I was treated with something I dreaded. It was a surreal experience, like being in 2 places at the same time. On one hand I was in the hold of the gunship and was looking outside at the space scrapers flashing by us. Yet, through my connection with Ahsoka, I perceived what was happening in the temple. It was like the nightmarish memories of Vail-on Shilly. I could only helplessly watch what was happening. In the Great Hall, Rex opened fire on the advancing Magna Guards as the Jedi charged them. He was able to hit few times the rightmost droid in the head, but that only slowed it down. The Mon Calamari Jedi twirled his saber in his hands and struck it in the ground. A wave of telekinetic energy flew from his blade and moved under the droids, then exploded upwards. The Magna Guards were thrown straight in the air. Ahsoka and Barriss jumped at the momentarily helpless droids but were intercepted by the 2 acolytes. Nadar let the Padawan to face the Dark Jedi for the time being and he jumped at the closest airborne robot. He sliced the machine in 2 and before landing threw his lightsaber at another. Rex used this opportunity to unload shot after shot at the momentarily disabled Magna Guards and managed to take out one of the droids. The machines crashed on the ground and before they could recover, Veb and Rex were upon them. Concentrated blaster fire destroyed another droid, leaving the last 2 to face the male Jedi. They were behind the rest of the combatants, so the clone commander did not have a good shot at them. Barriss was holding her own against the male acolyte, but Ahsoka was not so fortunate. The woman she was facing was something else. There was no sight of the furious attacks which the Padawan had expected thanks to her encounters with Ventress. Instead she was facing cold and calculated precision. Every movement the female she was fighting with made was measured and economic. The only reason why Tano was not falling back in front of the woman was because the Dark Jedi was not advancing but content to probe Ashoka's defenses and take her measure. The woman was using a Mikoshi form which she had modified to suit her own mindset. On the other side of the hall the tide of battle suddenly turned. The advance of the droids and their few Dark Jedi leaders was stopped cold when a small, green figure jumped from one of the upper floors. Yoda landed on the ground and his lightsaber flew from his belt to his outstretched right hand. He frowned at the carnage that littered his temple. His ears drooped in regret. He had failed his people. For a second time the Sith had waltzed in the Jedi temple without a care in the world. To his left a young Padawan was fighting in a desperate attempt to shield his fallen master but was hard-pressed to survive against two droids using Force staffs. For a brief second anger flashed through the ancient eyes of the Jedi's Grand Master before being beaten back and locked away. The two Magna Guards crumbled to the floor, smashed to pieces. It was like a careless giant stepped on and flattened the machines. Yoda gave a small nod to the Twi'lek Padawan and jumped in the fray. He was an emerald blur which moved from droid to droid, leaving machines destroyed by precise strikes behind. The frantic efforts of the commandos to shoot him down had no effect. They either missed the small ball of mayhem or their shots were expertly directed back to the sender. Only the Magna Guards lasted a moment or two longer because they were simply a bit sturdier, and Yoda was not about to exhaust himself when he did not know if those were the only forces he'll have to face that day, so he did not go all out. He had turned over 30 droids into scrap metal when two of the Dark Jedi darted in his way. The look of determination on the small Jedi's face never wavered and he jumped at his new attackers. Yoda parried a slash by one and rolled over a sweeping strike from the other. Before landing for a split second he tried to cut the left side of one of his adversaries, but the man managed to interpose his saber in front of the attack. The Jedi touched the ground and slashed at the legs of the same man only to be forced to jump away from an overhead strike by the other. While in midair he pulled his first target towards him with a telekinetic force and landed on the unfortunate man's shoulder. His emerald blade was buried in the Dark Jedi's mask. He jumped up when a horizontal strike aimed at him decapitated the dead man. Yoda parried another slash and went on the offensive. He was jumping and spinning around the remaining fallen Jedi who was desperately trying to parry or avoid slashes coming from all sides. The man had to jump when Yoda found himself at his feet and tried to cut him off at the knees. The Grandmaster grabbed the airborne man in a solid force grip and slammed him in the ground hard enough to crack the marble. The broken man expired with a lightsaber blade struck through the top of his head. Yoda rolled between a pair of commander droids who were taking pot shots at his Jedi, jumped up and took their heads with a single strike. From the height of his brief flight he saw a sight that made his eyes widen. Ever since they felt Master Yoda joining the fight, the Jedi were heartened and fought with redoubled efforts. Naha, with the help of a lucky shot by Rex, was able to deal with another of the Magna Guards, leaving him only one as an obstacle to helping the Padawan. That's when everything went wrong for the Jedi. Rex was trying to find a clear shot to the remaining droid. He was not about to send blaster bolts where Ahsoka and her friend were engaged with the Sith. A stray shot there could end deflected at anyone. The commander sensed something from behind him and tried to roll away, but an invisible force slammed in his side and sent him flying at a nearby column. He struck the hard stone with a grunt of pain. He felt a rib or two snapping in his right side. Rex frantically searched for his pistols which he had dropped, but before finding his weapons an armored foot slammed in his left side and sent him back at the column. He looked up and found himself staring at the barrel of a heavy blaster held by a man in a grey Mandalorian armor. "Don't!" grunted the warrior who had him at gunpoint. Rex glanced to the battle between the Jedi and his heart froze. Another enemy had stalked up to them unnoticed. Ventress was upon the Padawan like a fury. The girls sensed her in the last moment but could hardly disengage from their opponents in order to face her. Barriss was the one to feel her wrath. The young Jedi stepped back so she could face both the enemy she was engaging and the onrushing Sith. She looked grimly at her new enemy and prepared to defend herself. However, moments later she found out that Ventress was on another level altogether from the man she was facing. And the female Sith was pissed off. Despite that, the young Mirialan managed to hold off both of them for few seconds. Their blades moved too fast for ordinary human eyes to follow as they clashed in a short and lethal union. Barriss deflected a slash that would have cut off her left hand and would have demolished her heart, but was not fast enough to defend herself from Asage's next attack. The Sith woman darted forward and plunged her scarlet blade in the Jedi's gut. "Tano, stand down or your friend is finished," growled Ventress. Ahsoka shouted Orphe's name and tried to run to her aid but was stopped cold by her own opponent. The female acolyte used the distraction to swipe at the Padawan's saber arm and left a deep burn scar on it. Skywalker's apprentice shouted in pain and surprise before finding herself on the ground after being kicked in the back of her knees. She tried to stand up but froze when a hand snaked around her and a crimson lightsaber blade was activated centimeter from her throat.
That's quite enough, Jedi.
Drop your weapon or the girls die. Ventress ordered the Mon Calamari male who had just disposed of the last Magna Guard. Veb glared at the Sith but after seeing the condition of the Padawan nodded sullenly and deactivated his lightsaber. He glared at the Dark Jedi and let his weapon fall to the ground. Nadar cursed when he was yanked hard by a force pull and found himself lying on the ground next to Barriss, who was clutching her abdomen and moaning quietly. Ahsoka grunted when she was thrown to nearby on the floor and the woman who had kept her at lightsaber point turned around and spoke through a voice amplifier. She could be heard over the rumbling sounds of the battle. Master Yoda, unless you want to see more of your Jedi die, you will stand down now. As if those words were a predefined signal, the droids and remaining acolytes disengaged and jumped back from their enemies. The Grand Master of the Order stared at the Dark Jedi who apparently led this attack. The woman nodded at one of her men who raised his red lightsaber over the prone form of Ahsoka Tano. Drop your weapons now or more of you will die. She nodded at the acolyte. Many of the Jedi in the Great Hall could see how the Dark Jedi's lightsaber arched towards the young Togruta who was laying stunned on the ground.
Not again, I hissed through clenched teeth.
We were close, damn it. Only 20 more seconds and the Lats could fly straight through the demolished doors of the temple. My right hand shook while gripping a handhold so hard that the metal under my fingers groaned. I could see through Ashoka's unfocused eyes the crimson blade falling for the kill. == Part 5. East Ballroom, Senate Building, Coruscant. Anakin did not flinch when the blaster bolt flew centimeters from his side and hit Senator Beniblis in the stomach. However, he stiffened when a scared Padme shouted his name and engulfed him in a frantic embrace from behind. Her hands were busy roaming all over his front searching for injury before it dawned to her that he was not hurt and she composed herself. Skywalker glared at the smirking cutthroat who had sheathed his blaster and was grinning at them. If eyes could kill, Bane would be a stream of scattered atoms by now. The Jedi could feel his anger and fear bubbling in him, trying to gain control. The whispers of the dark side which was out there, just waiting for him to reach for her, was not doing anything good for his state of mind. Before meeting Vale, Anakin would have tried to suppress his anger, put it in a small box and lock it away. To disregard the dragon which lived deep within his heart. There is no emotion, only peace. Right. Try telling that to my anger. He mentally snorted. His feelings were real. Not something that could be simply disregarded or discarded. All the wonderful ones. And those leading to a particular kind of madness and self-destruction. For first time in his life, instead of trying to deal with his emotions the Jedi way, which had never worked for him, see the wife who was embracing him from behind, or stumble in the dark grasping for a way to deal with his feelings, he decided to do something different. Anakin followed an advice given to him by Del-Qatar and let the anger flow through him. Instead of fighting it all the way, Skywalker channeled his emotions. Used them with a purpose. For a moment he saw red and was terrified. If it was not for Padme holding him and her presence acting as an anchor, he probably would have lost it and went berserk just like that time on Tatooine. But she grounded him and gave him the strength to rally himself so he won't be controlled by his anger, which was about to turn into pure fury. Just as fast it had come, the perceived lack of control was gone and he was in charge again. Yeah. Suddenly Anakin felt the need to bash his head into the nearest flat surface. Del-Qatar had warned him not to try this stunt for the first time without someone to monitor him, because after a life when he was trying to suppress his feelings, they might overwhelm him if he let his emotions run mostly free. He let those thoughts go. This was not the place or time for self-blame. Padme was here and was in danger. That was the important thing. Anakin looked around the ballroom with new eyes. He could feel the force rushing through him like an unchained river which until now had been barred by a dam which was no longer there. Its rejuvenating power coursed through his veins and he felt more powerful than ever before. His eyes stopped at each of the charges and the laser emitters attached to them, which created a crimson spider web around him and the senators. He glanced at the 24 commando droids surrounding them and the few bounty hunters lounging around Bane. How was he going to get his wife and preferably the senators too, from this mess? == Near the holding cells, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Dooku and Kadrian separated, moving to flank the Jedi Master. That gave a clear firing lane to the bounty hunters and the remaining droids, 2 of which were Magna Guards, the only survivors of a group which had dealt with a bunch of Jedi who had tried to reinforce the prison guards. The remaining commando droids placed their blasters on clamps built in their backs and drew vibroblades. Both machines and bounty hunters waited for a sign to attack. The Force users looked at each other for a moment, then they exploded in action. Windu sent a wave of Force energy at the woman, staggering her in the middle of her charge, and turned to his left side where he met the former Jedi-turned-Sith Lord head-on. Purple and crimson blades crashed with tremendous force, and Dooku was forced to step back in an attempt to keep his balance. His missing arm not only halved the power with which he could swing his blade, it also disrupted the balance of his body and would take him time and training to become accustomed to it, or to the changes a prosthetic would bring. What was worse in his opinion was the slightly diminished connection he had with the Force because of his lost limb. So the first clash of blades was enough for the Count to conclude that he won't be able to win a one-on-one battle with Mace. It was fortunate that he did not have to face the Jedi Master alone. Windu was forced to jump back and to the left to avoid being attacked from behind by Cadrian, whose blade swept through the position where the black man stood. Dooku sent a concentrated lance of telekinetic energy at his former comrade who was surging at Say's flank. Windu blocked the attack by creating a half-dome of Force energy in front of him before the spear of invisible power slammed into him. A whoosh of displaced air could be heard. The clash of energies could be actually seen as attack and shield collided. Mace remained unharmed, but his charge at the Zabrak woman was disrupted and she could recover from her failed attempt to slash him in the back. Windu faced the two Sith who moved in tandem, leaving enough distance between themselves so they did not get in the way of each other, a typical mistake of people who had not trained to fight as a team. On the Jedi's left, Dooku was advancing behind his stabbing lightsaber, which he used as a rapier. In his current condition, the old man had no intention to enter a contest of strength with his younger and hale adversary. On the right, Mace was confronted by the powerful strikes and slashes which were emblematic for the Jimso form. For all his skill with lightsaber, Windu was hard-pressed to defend himself when confronted by these two radically different styles at the same time. In order to counter the woman, he had to place significant strength behind his parries and strikes, which slowed him down a bit. Dooku's insistent attempts to skewer him required different approach, unless he could concentrate only on the traitor. The matter was not made easier by the inherently offensive nature of his own Vapad style. Windu could not cut loose against those two. Not when he had to keep them between himself and their criffing droids, or risk to either be shot/stabbed or bludgeoned and shocked. He glanced at the bounty hunters. At least two of those had flamethrowers mounted on their arm guards. Or fired. Where were the other Jedi? He was definitely not above asking for help when he needed it. When all was said and done, neither the Order nor the Republic had much use for dead heroes. Not that he saw himself as such. Windu had always done what he believed right for the people he was responsible for. As a Jedi Master, that included most if not all other Jedi and the Republic as a whole. That's why he had to stop Dooku from escaping. He was a former Jedi who was a living proof that letting people leave the Order and go on their own was a monumental mistake for which everyone was paying even before the end of the war. The only thing he felt towards a man he once saw as a kind of a mentor was pity, and determination to stop him at all costs. The Jedi Master's thoughts ran in similar way as far as that other Sith was concerned. Windu did not know what games Vale was playing, but that man had to be stopped. He felt it in his bones. If Vale was left to his own devices, the Order as it was now would cease to exist, replaced by some kind of abomination molded by the ideals of that monster. He had seen the records from the Great War all those eons ago. The murdered and tortured Jedi. Shattered Republic fleets. Whole worlds burned from Order by that man's command. Mace shuddered to think what would have happened if Vale was not catapulted to the future. That Sith was a special kind of monster. Even worse than most common animals with who he shared name. Vale and Dooku were the greatest danger the Jedi and the Republic faced in millennia. It was not only their skills as battlefield commanders. Far from it. Their ability to use honeyed words to corrupt their enemies as well as their patience, that was the true threat that they represented. It was a danger that the Republic and unfortunately a lot of young Jedi, both Padawan and Knights, were not ready to face. Left unchecked, those two could shatter the integrity of the Order and the Republic it had to protect without firing a shot. Their words were poison which would find all too many receptive ears. Indeed, who would balk when one of those two offered a much easier and faster path to master the Force? It will be a lie, but the dark side is insidious. It confuses the mind and blinds. The power it confers in the short term is a mere hook, a tool which uses to twist a person until no one could recognize him anymore. He was present for Tano's report and immediately saw the danger. The poor girl was unwittingly walking towards a path that will destroy her. Damn that man. He was openly corrupting young Jedi and right now was untouchable. Those blind fools who had never brushed with the dark side, both the senators and the countless masses, could never understand why a Jedi needed to cast off his feelings. Emotion was the greatest enemy to a Force sensitive. It left you open to the predations of the dark side. But those who did not know the Force simply could not see it that way. For them, feeling emotions was the natural thing. So in the court of public opinion, Vale would be a winner as long as he was careful and did not show his true face. Windu ducked under a swipe from the woman that nearly took off the top of his head and deflected to the side a stab from Dooku. Getting distracted in the middle of combat almost got him killed. Mace was still kneeling when he staggered under a powerful downward strike from the woman. Dooku was moving to attack him again and he was in a bad position. Windu twisted his wrists to change the angle in which his and Kadrian's sabers were locked and rolled to the right. His left leg snapped along the ground and he kicked the woman's feet from under her. The Jedi Master was barely able to stand up when Dooku jumped over the prone form of Say and slashed at Mace. Windu parried and went on the offensive, seeing probably the only opening he was going to get in this battle. He surged forward with his purple blade dancing in an unpredictable manner. With every strike he was battering at the unsteady guard of Dooku and forcing the old man to retreat. The Vapad Master saw his opportunity and unleashed his deadly style. He let the Force fly through him and siphoned the dark side-derived energies surrounding his opponents like cloaks. Only the Count's excellent footwork and decades of experience permitted him to remain millimeters away from the purple blade, seeking a piece of his flesh. Kadrian's attempts to counterattack and break up the Jedi's momentum turned out to be unsuccessful. Windu moved like a storm front, keeping the Sith between himself and the droids and bounty hunters. Every time Say tried to flank him, he maneuvered in such a way as to mitigate any advantage she would have gained or used brute force attacks to keep her close to Dooku. Ironically enough, despite being the least experienced of the three combatants, thanks to her preferred style, Kadrian was the one better suited to face Mace's powerful attacks. But considering that Windu resembled more a whirlwind of purple blades than a man at that time, it was largely irrelevant. Enemy reinforcements just entered the temple. Vale is on one of the lats. The calms worn by the bounty hunters came to life with the voice of one of the scouts watching for the Republic's response. Dooku swore and nodded at the mercenaries and the droids. It was time to leave. The Sith wasted a moment pondering the look of anger that flashed over Windu's face when he heard about Vale's arrival. So at least the good Jedi Master was not on good terms with the Republic's rising star. That was a useful information to have. Dooku's lightsaber was battered away, leaving him open for attack, but before the purple blade could cut into his side, Kadrian's weapon intercepted the attack. Then the two Magna Guards were upon Windu, followed by the commandos. The old man breathed a sigh of relief. He summoned his lightsaber from the ground and followed the bounty hunters, who waved him to hurry up. Windu used a massive wave of force to throw the droids out of his way and jumped after the running Sith, only to have to scramble back when 4 flamethrowers bathed his way with hellfire. Before the bounty hunters stopped feeding the wall of fire, the droids were back on their feet and fell on Mace like a pack of starving dogs. The Jedi Master raised his blade over his head and charged the machines. =RK=, Great Hall, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Yoda glared at the Dark Jedi, who had 3 of his people on their mercy. A concept that those fallen to the dark side lacked. 2 of the acolytes were blocking his way. He could easily blow through them, but not in time to save young Ahsoka. Or his other 2 Jedi. The lull in the battle gave an opportunity to most people present in the hall to watch the unfolding tragedy. The Grand Master fought the urge to look away. Ahsoka was another child he had failed. Just like all other Jedi lying dead in the hall. This was the one building in the galaxy where his people should have been safe. The ancient being's eyes widened. He could see it through the Force moment before it happened. So he acted. The 2 Dark Jedi facing him were blown away like twigs on the way of a hurricane, as well as the droids who were nearby and could stop him. Nadar used the Force to reinforce his body to the breaking point and beyond. He knew that any direct attack would be sensed and stopped before it could do anything, so he went another way. He moved like a blur and was over Ahsoka before the crimson lightsaber was halfway down. The attempt of Ventress to throw him out of his way with the telekinesis splashed over the energy surrounding his body. He was in front of the swinging lightsaber and made a pushing motion with his arms, discharging the force he had gathered. He could feel the power racing to his hands and smiled. The Mon Calamari blinked in confusion when he felt the force dissipating, with only a fraction of it pushing the Dark Jedi stumbling a couple of steps back. Something caught his attention and he looked to the right. The masked woman had her saber arm outstretched and her weapon was not in sight. Nadar looked down and his smile became sad. There was a still active lightsaber sticking to his right side. Veb had a moment to wonder why it did not hurt before slowly toppling to the ground like a centuries-old tree. Ashoka's sight cleared and in front of her horrified gaze the spark of life departed Nadar's eyes. She was oblivious to the men who had tried to execute her actions. He snarled and jumped forward, ready to impale her on his blade. The shocked Padawan felt a tug and was hastily pulled away from the descending blade which stabbed the marble floor. That was the last help Yoda could give her, because he was attacked by a mixed group of Magna Guards and commando droids. One of the Dark Jedi he had thrown away had recovered enough to join the fun. "You should have stood down, Jedi," muttered the masked woman. She made an intricate motion with her left hand and Ahsoka froze where she stood. She could feel a cocoon of force which felt sickly sweet, twisted around her body, preventing her from moving. The masked man stood up and walked towards her. "Third time is the charm, little Jedi. You are out of luck." Ahsoka frantically grabbed at the force with all her will. She was desperately trying to either free herself from this captivity or somehow stop the Dark Jedi. Her blue eyes widened in fright when his blade arched towards her head for the third time. =RK=, large gunship, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. I could kiss both that brave boy who sacrificed himself to protect Ahsoka and the little green troll who was dealing havoc upon the Sis forces in the temple. That thought flashed over the rage I was feeling. With every close call Ahsoka had while I was helpless to help her fed my fury. If I had a mirror, I bet that my eyes right then would have been sickly yellow. The light flew through the smoking remains of the main temple gates. Moments later I used the force to propel myself forward. I threw my lightsaber and used my mind to guide its flight. It ignited in midair with its crimson blade emanating the bloodthirst I felt towards those who dared to hurt Ahsoka. I am not really sure how or when it happened, but there was a part of my mind that saw in her something of the person my unborn daughter could become. I had not thought about the way I felt about her. The only way I could describe it at the time was a strong affection and overprotectiveness akin to something you could feel towards a younger sibling. The fledgling force connection only made those dormant feelings stronger. It was an excellent food for my fury. After I jumped from the LARP, the world moved in slow motion. I could see my lightsaber spinning lazily in the air, Ventress who was oh so slowly moving towards a female Jedi laying on the ground, and a masked woman who was turning towards the gunships. I twisted mid-flight so I could land on my feet while I gathered force-fueled lightning in my left palm. My lightsaber hit the blade of the man trying to cut down Ahsoka mid-swing with enough force to push back his weapon and make him stumble a step back. My armored boots hit the ground hard and sent a pulse of force energy which collided with the two female Dark Jedi. They were thrown off their feet but managed to use their powers to land safely a few meters away. The man was not so lucky. I sent a torrent of lightning at the bastard trying his best to kill Ahsoka. A part of my brain noted that she was kept in force-induced stasis and filed that bit of information for later digestion. I was too busy frying an idiot who wanted to be Sith without knowing what that truly was and guiding my lightsaber back to my outstretched right hand. The screams of the masked man was music to my ears. If it was not for the bloody single-mindedness of the droids, all combat in the Great Hall would have stopped. I could feel the shock of both the Jedi and their darker brethren at what they felt from me. I was drinking deeply from the dark side and channeling it in a way only a true Sith could. From my position its icy tendrils were spreading through the Great Hall, and the screams of the man under my lightning assault were rising high over the din of battle. What I used on him was not my battle version. Oh, not at all. I was not feeling particularly merciful. It was the standard Sith lightning attack that was made for torture. The man was suspended in the air with dark blue bolts of electricity arching through his body and grounding in the floor. I pushed more juice through my attack and he was pushed backwards. The Dark Jedi slammed hard in a column pockmarked by blaster fire and his smoking body lay still when it hit the ground. I gave a slight nod to Ahsoka who was still paralyzed and walked towards her until I was between the young Togruta and the two females who probably thought they were Sith. Hey. What a joke. Ventress. My voice hissed in a tone I did not immediately recognize.
It was foolish of you to participate in this mistake, I muttered. Now it clicked. It was I've heard only in my memories. That of Darth Vale.
I fixed Asajj with an icy glare.
Foolish children bumping in the night. I can see it in your stance. The way you move.
And in your eyes. I smirked.
You do not even comprehend what you are trying to emulate.
She glared fiercely at me.
I am Sith, she shouted but made no move to attack. I could see it plainly.
The strong aura of darkness that I had shrouded around myself like a common cloak was terrifying her as well as drawing her in.
And she did not know how to react. Nonsense. I snorted in response.
Girl, you barely qualify as a Dark Jedi.
I pointed my ignited lightsaber at her. You do not know the full power of the Force.
All I've seen you do is surrender to the dark side like a common thug. Where is your pride, woman? All I see are ignorant children who think that being slaves to the dark side is what mean to be a Sith. You are a bunch of blind fools. My voice was gaining strength with each word until it was a dull roar echoing throughout the great hall. I glared at the women. You want to be Sith? I will educate you. It's time to learn what means to face a true Sith. It will hurt. A lot. A sinister smile stretched my lips. I gathered upon myself the dark side energies I was letting loose around me like a mantle and surged forward. Living shadows clung around me like a cloak which chilled the blood of everyone looking at me. The Force Unleashed. =RK=. Part 1. Great Hall, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. I stalked towards Ventress and her dark Jedi friend. The latter, a masked woman, raised her lightsaber in an overhead grip and charged me. I pointed my left hand in her direction and unleashed a wave of lightning that she caught on her blade but was forced to stop by the intensity of the attack. My eyes never left Asajj's face, who looked at me with apprehension. She summoned another lightsaber to her left hand from the blackened corpse of the man I fried and prepared to face me with her two weapons. Her spine stiffened and I could see determination shining in her dark eyes. I smiled thinly. So you do have spine then? Splendid. I ceased my lightning assault at the masked woman and sent a nearby piece of shuttle's wing flying her way. Behind me, the clones were deploying and opening fire on the remaining droids. The weapon pods mounted on the gunships were making mincemeat of any concentration of enemy forces that was sufficient distance from the Jedi fighting in the hall. The woman jumped over the smoldering piece of metal that flew her way just as I expected her to do. She was slammed backwards by a telekinetic wave that I sent at her. She flew back and bounced off one of the columns lining the Great Hall. I returned my attention to Ventress, who was running at me with raised swords. I faced her with bloodlust roaring through my veins. The dark side was whispering to me that my enemies were at my mercy and I should take exquisite joy in destroying them. For once I agreed with its seductive suggestions. I called to my empty left hand the lightsaber of the fallen Mon Calamari Jedi, the plain hilt rising from the ground and floating to my open palm. I think that the kid would have approved that his weapon be used one last time against those who slew him. The azure blade, the color of virgin sea, came to life and I pointed it at the heart of Ventress, who was nearly upon me. My crimson lightsaber battered aside the sword in her left hand and the Jedi's weapon I held parried a diagonal slash aimed at my heart. In the first moments of our battle, Asajj's torso was left wide open. I grasped the opportunity and I kicked her with my right leg like a battering ram. The sole of my foot connected with her midriff. My kick knocked the air out of her lungs, sending her tumbling through the air. I absent-mindedly slashed behind me with the Jedi blade and deflected a scarlet lightsaber thrown at my back. The masked woman was back in the fight and she too had acquired additional weaponry. The Dark Jedi's own lightsaber was in her right hand but her left was gripping one of the saber staffs of the fallen temple guards. While she was sprinting my way, she ignited the three blades. Her dark cloak and grey armor were illuminated by crimson and emerald glow. The masked woman attacked me with sweeping strikes which I either parried or sidestepped. It was almost easy. The way she was wielding her weapons was awkward. She had let herself fall under the influence of the dark side. While her attacks were powerful, they were erratic, lacking precision. If I paid attention, I could dance around her the whole day without receiving a scratch. I was not in the temple for dodge training, though. The strength behind my strikes increased as I stopped testing her technique, which was lacking, and not only because she was letting her anger blind her. I started cursing Darth Bane and Darth Sidious in Huttese. Properly trained, the
the woman I was facing would have been something to watch. As she was now, a mere initiate in Korriban's academy could fight with her and prevail. Despite her strength in the Force, both Jedi and the so-called Sith of this age were soft, weak. However, there was hope yet for them. The war was young. There would be enough time for the survivors of both sides to be tempered and reforged. The flames of the Clone Wars would see to that, and if I had anything to say about it, neither the Jedi Order or the Sith would continue to exist as the corrupted abominations they were in this day and age. I was advancing against the masked woman. My weapons were stabbing closer and closer to her body while she was desperately trying to interpose her blades between my attacks and herself. I rotated to the left, avoiding a clumsy counterattack, and used my momentum to batter aside her single-hilt lightsaber. She stumbled to the side under the force of my attack, and I twisted around once again and crouched under a weapon thrown by Ventress as she returned to the fight. My left leg swung parallel to the ground and struck the masked woman in the back of the knees, sending her tumbling to the ground. I aided it with a telekinetic push, thanks to which she was thrown away, bouncing off the floor. I felt Ahsoka's distress through our bond and threw the Mon Calamari's saber her way. I acted on instinct, not even realizing what I did before the azure blade was spinning through the air. A damaged Magna Guard had made its way to the still paralyzed kid and was about to crush her skull with its force staff. Nadar's blade flew true and was buried into the machine's torso, held in place by my will. I tugged at its hilt with the force and the saber moved erratically, slicing the droid to pieces. I could feel Ahsoka's relief and gratitude. I gave her a small nod. Ventress used that minor distraction to cross the distance separating us and attack. If she expected to surprise me, the woman was delusional. Her dark presence was like a delicious morsel to my senses. Our blades clashed with the unique sound of touching lightsabers, and I locked our weapons together. A deft twist of my wrist was all I needed to push her saber to my right. My left fist darted through the air and struck her right cheek. I felt bone snapping under the impact of my armor-clad hand. The hit staggered her, and I repeated it again and again, turning that side of her face into a bloody mess. A short and non-lethal lightning bolt later, she was convulsing on the ground. The masked woman was back on her feet and charging at me. You know, the definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again, expecting different results. I quipped at the Dark Jedi attacking me. She used telekinesis to send the remains of a few droids at me as a distraction and darted behind the scrap metal, with her lightsaber leading the way. I banished the metal pieces at the ceiling and rotated around her weapon, which was trying to skewer me. At the end of my spin, I stabbed at the back of the woman who was passing by me. My crimson blade entered her back and exploded through the armor over her chest. The masked woman stumbled a few steps forward and fell to her knees. I did not expect to hear her rasping laughter. She used her left hand to remove her mask and turned her face towards me. You were deceived. There was a smile on her disfigured face. Its right side was a sculpture presenting perfect features which could be the envy of any woman. But its left was deformed, with the eye mostly hidden by a drooping flesh. Ah, I see you've figured it out, she chuckled. This was not as badly planned as you might think. The words of the Chiss woman were lost to a fit of coughing. A clone. You were only days old, I declared, examining the creature carefully through the Force. If I had met the original, or if there were two copies of the same type in the temple, I might have sensed the deception earlier. As it was, there was nothing to tip me off besides her bad training, yet she was too powerful for a mere clone with no time to be trained. How? My eyes widened. I remembered a game I played back on my Earth. It felt ages ago. The Valley of the Jedi, I declared. Sidious had found it. And now everything made sense. All this was a distraction merged with a test. I had no doubt that unless the Jedi had their collective heads out of their asses for once, Dooku was getting away right now. My attention snapped back to the dying clone of the Chiss woman. I could feel Ventress' confusion. She was on the ground a few meters behind me and was staring at the clone. Well played. I congratulated the soon-to-be corpse. She gave me a stiff nod. I have no regrets. She coughed again. At least my death has meaning. On the contrary, child, I shook my head. I definitely did not mean well done. You've thrown your life, so now you can have a biscuit as a reward. Your masters saw that their pawns stood no chance against me, and found a way to address the issue of their incompetence. After all is said and done, quantity does have its own quality. Behind me, Ventress attempted one last surprise attack.
Foolish girl. I ducked under one of her sabers and parried the second. Our eyes met. I grabbed her left wrist before she could attack me again with the lightsaber in that hand. I drew power from the dark side to summon a lightning in the palm of my left hand, the same one holding Asajj's arm. The Dark Jedi shrieked as energies born from the dark side itself coursed through her body, lighting her nerves on fire. Her shouts were cut short when I buried my blade deep into her chest. Our eyes met and I saw the spark of life leaving her. Then something unexpected happened. I could feel a bit of power flowing from her corpse into me as the force in her body started dissipating. I shook my head. That was something to think about later. I released my hold on the remains of what until a moment ago has been Asajj Ventress slide to the ground in a boneless heap and returned my attention to the dying clone. I could feel the life force leaving her with every heartbeat. I knelt in front of her and gently lifted her chin so I could look her in the eyes. Black and green stared back at me. Around us the battle was ending. With Yoda cutting loose on the few remaining enemy clones and my troopers added to the mix, the remains of the Cis forces did not stand a chance. As the Chiss woman was weakening, so did the stasis field surrounded Ahsoka. The kid finally managed to cut through her bindings and stumbled to her feet. "Thank you, Delkatar," she mumbled with a sad smile and ran to the other wounded Padawan who had been lying abandoned on the ground. "Always, kid," I smirked at her and returned my full attention to the dying woman in front of me. "Such a waste," I muttered to her. "Is this what you truly desire, child? To throw away your life before you had a chance to experience it?" Inside I seethed with fury. What the Republic was doing with its clone army was bad enough. The Force-cursed separatists and that prick Sidious had gone a step further. This woman was a slave sent to die as a damn test. And she did not even know it. That was something that I wouldn't permit. "Look at me," I ordered. Her hooded eyes met mine. She was weakening fast. "Tell me, what do you wish? Not what you were told that you want. But what?" I poked her in the chest near the wound I carved in her torso, causing her to wince. "You desire for yourself." I stared in her eyes. Through the Force, I could sense the rough conditioning which was used to give her the minimum knowledge needed to accomplish this sick test. The same incompetent butcher had carved a geesh in her mind, convincing her that dying to accomplish her mission was all she could ever look up to. Whoever did that had just won a special fate when I got my hand on the bastard. Now she got my undivided attention. With no real training or experience to speak of, she had fought splendidly against the Jedi. That was something I had seen through Ahsoka's eyes. Her crude attacks were not a sloppy form or because of a lack of talent. On the contrary, during her battles she had drawn instinctive knowledge from the Force about the fundamentals of lightsaber combat. It was a rare talent that I had not seen in a very long time. I used a scalpel of pure force to cut around the crude mental programming that was imposed upon this unfortunate woman who was made to simply be sacrificed. I sliced through dark tendrils that represented the conditioning and subtly used my power to remove them. I carefully withdrew from her mind and looked at her eyes, which were already clearing. "Oh, what did you do?" She pouted like a little girl. "Set you free, little bird. Now answer me. What do you wish?" She looked at me with confusion. To be fair, it was a kind of a stupid question. She did not know enough about anything to know. Yet her answer was more than good enough. "To live," she whispered, amidst a fit of coughing. The days-old woman fixed my eyes with a determined stare. "To win." Despite being on her knees and my fingers holding her chin, she gave a small nod towards the lightsaber in my right hand, which was poking her painfully in the chest. I smiled at her proudly. "You'll do." I let the hilt of my saber slip from my fingers and clatter to the marble floor. I gathered the Force to me and used the emotions raging within my heart to demand its cooperation. I subjugated the dark side to my will, gathering its energies in my right hand. The power of the light side flowed to my left palm. I placed both hands on the chest of the expiring woman. Her mouth opened in a wordless "oh" and her eyes widened when the unleashed power of the Force blazed into her body. I could sense the Jedi gathering around us and felt their eyes upon me. Ahsoka was shouting something, but I could not afford to listen. I was literally holding the life of this woman in my arms. What little was left of her life force was gripped in my metaphysical fingers and held in place only by my will. I opened myself fully to the Force, becoming a conduit for the energies I was manipulating. Light and shadow danced around us. Through us. I could see the wound I had dealt to the woman,
and see that even without it she had only weeks to live. Whatever process was used to clone her original, who was undoubtedly one of the Dark Jedi in service of Sidious or Dooku, was far from perfect. Her DNA was unstable, breaking apart. Talk about expendable soldiers. I will not let you die. I won't fail again. I did not know that I shouted those words loud enough to shake the great hall. The poisonous touch of the dark side flowed like acid through the woman's veins, burning away strands of corrupted DNA. Right behind it, I poured copious amounts of light side energy, modulating it in such a way to rejuvenate dying flesh and rebuild the basic code of life. The hole in her chest was sealed shut by newly formed healthy flesh. Her heartbeat became steadier and stronger, while my own heart was hammering within my breast trying to jump out. I panted with the exertion of using so much power. I was by no means finished, but a warning I could not ignore was delivered through the Force. I quickly scaled down the energies I was channeling and looked around. The battle was over. I was surrounded by the majority of the clones who survived the skirmish. My men were tense. They were gripping their weapons, and I realized they were ready to aim and open fire. I wondered what had them on edge until I noticed the shouting. Yoda and Windu were arguing while Ahsoka was yelling at the Vapad Master. In a loose semicircle around my troopers were scores of Jedi, both Padawans and Knights. Some were looking at the arguing masters, but many more were staring at me. I extended my senses beyond the woman I was busy tending. She was by no means all right, but at least she was no longer in danger of dying anytime soon. I had stabilized her DNA enough that she could sustain her own life using the Force. For more, she needed to see a specialist who could devise a therapy to clean up the rest of the mess. With my limited knowledge, it was a small miracle that I was able to help her as much as I did. I stiffened when I felt the emotions of the Jedi surrounding us. A small but still significant number were in awe by my performance. But most of them were afraid. Those people were giving me wary looks. I could feel it. They wondered how big a threat I was. That was what Windu was arguing about. He was citing some kind of ancient law according to which the Jedi Order had jurisdiction over all Force sensitives in the Republic. Which included me too. I was a threat that could not be ignored, wasn't I? Damn Jedi. =RK=. Part 2. East Ballroom, Senate Building, Coruscant. Anakin was looking gloomily around the big room. He was confident that if the worst happened, he would be able to get Padme out of this death trap in one piece. The same could not be said about the rest of the senators and their staff. Many of those people were his wife's friends, so he was reluctant to leave them to their fate, even if he was not a Jedi. Truth to be told, he had a lot of options, in theory. What he'll be able to pull off while saving most of the hostages was different matter. He could use telekinesis to deal with most of the droids and mercenaries, temporarily, but such an act was likely to set off the charges around the room. It would be very easy for one of the enemies hurled by such an attack to cross one of the laser beams keeping the hostages secure. After what happened on Master Sakura's flagship not too long ago, Anakin was convinced that he wouldn't be able to use the Force to erect a force field around himself and the senators to protect them from the explosions. At best, he'll be able to save few people. At worst, even with the Force raging through him, now that he used his emotions to fuel its power, they all would be turned into pieces. Skywalker thought about trying to use what most people called the mind trick to influence Bane, but disregarded that idea almost immediately. Such a thing worked only on the weak-willed, and the bounty hunter was anything but. Failing in such an attempt was guaranteed to get people killed. If he had his lightsaber, he could have cut through the floor, provided there were not so many prying eyes. But that idea was not entirely without merit. He could use the Force to do it. It would not be fast, but he might be able to weaken the thick metal enough, without being noticed, so one massive strike could cave it in. At least some of the senators had a good chance of getting away. Yet, if he messed up, he could shake the room and blow them all up to the stratosphere. It all came back to the criffing bombs. If they weren't there. Anakin perked up at that thought and looked at the charges. He did not know how much explosive was in there or what kind. But he could see only the laser tripwires. He closed his eyes and concentrated on one of the charges. It took him more than a few minutes to make head from tails of what he was sensing, and then, Skywalker had to suppress a grin. There was a built-in receiver but no transmitter. The bombs were not linked by comms to detonate if one of them was tampered with. If they were, his plan would have gone down in flames.
Anakin admitted there was no way he would be able to disarm all the charges at the same time. By the Force, he would only be able to work on 2 or 3 at the same time, at best, and there were nearly 80 of the things. He concentrated on one of the charges with intangible fingers, and traced its internal mechanisms with the Force. Skywalker needed to sabotage the bomb in such a way that the enemy would remain unaware. It was a conventional explosive device, which meant that there was a detonator in the compound that was meant to be blown up. After a minute of careful probing, his fingers found it. Then a second and a third. Whoever built the thing was a firm believer in redundancy. With great care, Skywalker traced the wires that connected the detonators to separate power sources and thought about the best way to disable the device. It took him minutes of painstaking work to ensure that the bomb thought it was still armed and ready to go off. However, there would be no energy racing to the detonators. The charge was little more than expensive wall ornamentation now. 1 down. Too many left to deal with. Anakin hoped that the damn bounty hunter didn't decide to shoot more senators before he had disarmed most of the charges. Minutes later he had dealt with 4 more bombs when he sensed a disturbance in the Force. Anakin paled, and his head snapped to where he was hearing the death cries of Jedi. It was the temple. Bane noticed his reaction and chuckled. So the rumors are true. You Jedi can feel it when a number of your kind dies. The bounty hunter nodded to himself as if this was just a confirmation to something he knew. What have you done? Growled Anakin. Me? Nothing besides what you see around you. Tell me, Jedi, do I look like a fool? We always knew you wouldn't release Dooku, so steps were taken to release the good Count. The Sis wants him back. Skywalker stared at the mercenary's eyes and shivered. He was mistaken about the aim of the attacks. He could see it in the man's eyes. Bane had no intention of letting any of them go. Oh, Anakin knew that rescuing Dooku and Grievous were high on the Sep's priorities, but in the end it was a secondary goal. Skywalker was a Republic general, so he was painfully familiar with the strategic situation. The Sis held all the cards because Gar needed at least 6 more months to be truly ready for a war of this scale. Naturally, their enemies were not inclined to give them the needed time. The nightmare on Naboo was siphoning precious naval units for the blockade. With the consequences of the attack on Coruscant, the Republic was in an even worse situation. If the bastards managed to kill enough senators, the army was likely to be paralyzed while the remaining politicians scrambled to organize. If the political crisis became bad enough, the Sis could force peace on their own terms. A devastated Senate was unlikely to be able to resist. At least not with the Gar put on the defense upon all fronts as it was at the moment. Either that, or the Chancellor would be forced to take even more power to clean up the mess. However, in doing so Palpatine may damage the Republic beyond repair, the Republic he had been frantically trying to save ever since he became Chancellor. Anakin glared at the bounty hunter but declined to reply. He closed his eyes and sat down as if he were meditating. He disregarded the muttering of the senators, and concentrated on the next bomb. He was quickly running out of time. Skywalker gritted his teeth as he felt another Jedi die, and continued to disarm the charges. He was up to number 15 when his concentration was shattered, almost detonating the explosive by accident. Skywalker could feel Ahsoka fighting for her life, and losing. It was very hard for him to suppress the instincts screaming at him to run to the temple and help his Padawan. Anakin shuddered when he felt every one of her close calls. When she was caught in some kind of strange stasis field, he was ready to jump through the air. If it was not for all the people around him, counting on him to protect them, Skywalker would have been halfway to the temple by now. His body shook with impotent fury when he felt Ahsoka's despair. Anakin could almost see the blade descending towards his helpless Padawan. Then everything changed. A wave of dark side energies exploded from the location of the Jedi temple and drowned everything else with its oppressive miasma. The last thing he could clearly sense from Ahsoka was relief. Anakin smiled in a way that looked just wrong on the face of any Jedi. Anakin knew the source of that dark power. He had wondered why Vale had not tried to save the hostages and him, but now he knew. His fellow general had gone to the temple, and was unleashing a fury that matched the emotions within his own heart. Skywalker just hoped that the rest of the Jedi would not overreact about Del-Qatar. He smirked and returned to dealing with the bombs. Padme was looking at him in a way that demanded answers. He soundlessly mouthed later, and then returned his attention to the delicate work of disarming the bombs without using his physical limbs. RK equals Great Hall, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. I rose on my shaky feet and looked around again. If I was so inclined, this mess would make a great justification for something resembling Order 66. That way I could have rid the galaxy from most of the irrevocably brainwashed Jedi. I had carefully removed the worst of the mental conditioning from my troopers during the weeks when my forces were being assembled. This was one of the reasons why my soldiers were ready to back me up to the hilt. But after dealing with the droids, only 24 of the clones were still on their feet, and combat ready, with 5 additional medics caring for the wounded. I had arrived at the temple with 50 people, excluding the pilots. Half of my men were lying dead or wounded. Death without purpose was something that I never found acceptable during my time as Darth Vader. For most Sith commanders, their troops were expendable resources. That was a school of thought that I had never subscribed to, and as a result the soldiers under my command tended to have much better morale. I smiled proudly at my men. They were professionals, and knew that if the Jedi decided to do something stupid, and attack us, there was not much that they could do. There was infantry on the ground, and 2 gunships floating protectively over my head. If the Jedi decided to be violent, they would be met in kind. Knowing my men, there were heavy reinforcements on the way as well. I shook my head. With the Senate taken hostage by Sith agents, I did not have time to deal with the Jedi's insecurities. They were justified, I'll grant you that. I wanted the Order in its current state dismantled, ensuring that the fanatics amongst the Jedi were not free to cause problems with my future plans, but that did not mean that I was too keen on Sidious going through with Order 66. There were some good people in the organization who I would prefer to be reformed under the ancient Jedi creed, or as Sith, under my teachings and not under the dogma from any of the sects that existed in the Empire. Or even worse, this rule of 2 abomination. I swayed with exhaustion and one of the nearby clones grabbed my left arm to help keep me upright. "Thank you, Corporal," I muttered quietly. I gathered some of the ambient force energy drowning the temple, and used it to rejuvenate myself a bit. It did not make me even close to 100%, but it took the edge off the weakness I was feeling. I stretched and heard my bones creaking. I needed to rest, damn it. But there was no use in hoping for something I knew I would not receive any time soon. I strode slowly towards the arguing Jedi. At the moment, I was in charge of the whole clusterfuck on Coruscant, but I was out of communication with either ships in orbit or the forces investing the Senate for the last 15 minutes or so. I prayed that the building was still standing, or if it had fallen I prayed Palpatine had died with it. I may have missed his death while preoccupied. Nah. Neither I or the galaxy were that lucky. I heard argument as I moved closer. Delcatar has not made a single action against the Jedi. He came here, risking his life to help us while he probably should have been dealing with the situation at the Senate. And how do you want to repay him for his assistance? Ahsoka Tano was almost foaming at the mouth. Mace Windu was glaring at Tano as if he were tempted to activate his lightsaber. Ahem. I cleared my throat loudly. I had to keep myself from smiling when Windu almost jumped. I regretted that I was not able to pay closer attention to the show, and hoped that my soldiers had the cameras in their helmets up and running. Yoda, who looked much older than the last time I spoke with him, nodded in my direction. If his expression was anything to go by, the Grand Master of the Jedi Order was becoming tired of the arguments. Master Yoda, Ahsoka. I am glad you are fine, considering the circumstances. I pointedly excluded Windu. Fine, we are not. But your sentiment, appreciated, it is, said Yoda. It's time to end this farce, hissed Mace. The Sith are a forbidden organization in the Republic. In the name of the Galactic Senate you are under arrest, he declared grandly. I snorted. 2 points. First, prove it. I am willing to bet that I do not qualify as a Sith under Republic law. I was a member of an organization of the same name, nearly 4,000 years ago. And second, I am not a Republic citizen. I have not broken any Republic law, Jedi. Third, at the moment I am the GAR commander responsible for all Republic forces on Coruscant until we can contact High Command or the Chancellor. Under the circumstances, first it should be confirmed that Palpatine is not acting under duress before he could countermand my authority. So, choose your next words very carefully. You have no reason to arrest me besides your fears. I have not done a single thing against either the GAR or the Republic, I declared calmly. If anyone is wondering, I did check the Republic laws concerning me and the Sith in general. In the last 1,000 years some very interesting loopholes were added by newer laws. Ironically, the Jedi were the ones who granted me the greatest boon possible as far as legal protection goes, the fact that I stated in front of their Grand Master that I was a Sith, and he did not order my arrest. With that information in hand, any half-competent counselor could argue that what I thought to be Sith, and what I considered myself, was nothing like the monsters of old with which I only shared a name. The fun part was that if the matters ever reached court, Palpy would gleefully support me in an attempt to hamstring the Jedi. After all, I stood as an example for a staunch defender of the Republic, a successful and popular general. All the while, the Jedi were unable to keep in custody the engineer behind the Sith, a former Jedi to boot. Lawyers and politicians are such fun people. To a Sith. Let's leave the courts to decide, Sith, Windu spat. I could see that he prayed for me to resist. That would permit him to attack me in my weakened state. As we all know, history is written by the victors. With me, and my clone troopers, out of the picture, the Jedi would be free to spin whatever outlandish story they wanted. You can't just arrest him. Del Qatar has done nothing wrong, protested Ahsoka. Padawan Tano. Be silent. One more word and I'll see you expelled. The Togruta teenager glared daggers at him. She looked between me and the Vatapad master. Hasty such an action is, Master Windu, said Yoda in an attempt to defuse the situation. Our argument was put on hold when 6 darts flew through the remains of the shattered main doors. The gunships flew over us and from them repelled scores of heavily armed clone troopers. A Jedi Master I knew jumped from the leading troop transport and hurried to join us. I could feel the turbulent emotions of the newcomer. I was sure the reason for that was one of my contingency plans in place just in case some of the Jedi decided to make fools from themselves. Windu was a case in point. The Jedi who surrounded my troopers and I looked uneasy when the clones who just arrived moved to face them. Yoda looked around with a sad expression on his face while Windu gave me a satisfied smirk. Now, you all see the truth. The Vatapad master pointed at the clones. The Sith is about to show his true colors. I shook my head in exasperation. I knew that Windu despised me for what I was ever since he laid his eyes upon me, but this was bloody madness. He was about to screw over the Jedi in such a way that even Sidious would be envious. You see, the darts which brought me to the temple had various cameras. What was happening here was streamed live to the various Scar commands on Coruscant which were not jammed, as well as to the fleet in orbit. =RK=. Part 3. Republic Cruiser Requiem, high orbit over Coruscant. Commodore Palion, who under orders from General Vale, had assumed command over all Navy forces over the capital, watched with trepidation the live feed from the Jedi Temple. The revelation about what his commander truly was not as much a shock as one might expect. Gilad was not blind. While it was easy to see that Vale was a Force user, he was nothing like any of the Jedi the officer knew or imagined them to be. When Palion saw the Jedi Temple under attack, he was torn. Oh, the Order members had great reputation, one they managed to keep mostly intact for nearly 1,000 years. However, for most people the Jedi were just a myth. Even with present-day speed of travel, the explored galaxy was enormous. It was not surprising that only a very small percentage of the population had actually met a Jedi or seen them in action. That was all changing with the onset of this war. Truth to be told, as a kid Palion had admired the Jedi and the tales about their incredible achievements, something that had not really changed as he grew up. But then the war started and the Jedi were immediately given the ranks of generals and commanders, without any military training. As a ship's captain, Gilad was privy to a lot of confidential information. Thanks to his lover, who was an reagent, he knew even more. Both Gar internal after-action reports and the rumor mill painted a grim picture. While as warriors, the Jedi were superb, excelling in relatively small battles where they could have a great impact on an individual tactical level, the performance of most of them as commanders was sorely lacking. The list of bloody ground battles and shattered ships thanks to their mistakes was horrendous. The fact that most Jedi now outranked men and women with decades of actual experience in the Army and Navy just acted as an additional point of friction. Gilad shook his head. This whole war was dragging the Jedi Order through the mud, and they couldn't even realize it. There were times he wondered if most of the Jedi understood the rest of the galaxy. While his respect for the Jedi as individuals was still there,
That of the Order as an organization had gone down the drains when the Jedi Council had taken the offered command position for the Jedi with barely a notice and sent unprepared boys and girls to lead troops in battle. He did not blame too much the Jedi who fought and died with their soldiers, but their leaders who had put everyone in such a position without a second thought. The Commodore stared grimly at the holy display showing the live feed from the temple. Vale, who for some reason had healed the Chiss woman he had impaled with his lightsaber, rose up swaying and one of the clones helped steady him. Palion watched grimly as Master Windu declared that he was placing the general under arrest. From the corners of his eyes he could see his aide and some of the clones working on the bridge wincing. When Gar reinforcements arrived on the scene, Gilad and the crew who were watching felt relieved. The medics from the second flight of Larts to arrive were already spreading through the former battleground and helping the wounded, while the clone troopers were taking defensive positions around their still-standing brethren, ready to protect the general. In the long term it did not matter how the situation was resolved. The Jedi had just taken a hit to their credibility that they would spend decades recovering from. Right now, the Republic was in a grey area. With the Senate, the Chancellor and the GAR headquarters out of communication and presumed either destroyed or under duress, General Vale had taken charge and had a very good case for being the acting Supreme Commander of all Republic forces. At the very least he was in command of everything in the capital system. Trying to arrest the general for what amounted to trumped-up charges, during such a crisis was madness. Or treason. Added a small voice in the back of Palion's mind. As far as the Commodore knew, Vale had not done a single thing against the interests of the Republic. Just the contrary, in fact, in a few skirmishes, the general had won great strategic victories for the GAR. More than the Jedi combined could boast so far. He knew that the stunt pulled by Windu was not going to go well with the troops. It was obvious that the Jedi was banking on the revelation that Vale was a Sith to carry the day. However, the Sith were little more than a half-forgotten story told to scare children into behaving. Gilad was ready to bet anything that the general had done his homework and knew what he was talking about when he stated that he could not be considered a Sith under Republic law. That would be enough for a lot of people, especially when combined with Vale's record so far. To be fair, Dooku, the man who forged the Sith and was leading them until his capture, was a former Jedi turned Sith. Palion found it deliciously ironic that another Sith was now on the side of the Republic to balance things. He only hoped that Dooku was still in custody, that bald woman Vale killed was supposed to be in prison too. Letting the Count escape would be another nail in the coffin of the Jedi's reputation. The Commodore cursed quietly. They had more than enough problems to deal with without the Jedi making additional problems. He glared at the screen where a close-up of Windu's smug smile could be seen. Palion hoped that the Jedi who had just arrived at the temple could help cool down the explosive situation, but that was not something he could afford to count on. Calms, give me a line to the fleet. I want half of the reserve ground forces heading towards the Jedi temple yesterday. Those fools aren't taking the general without a fight. Make sure that the boys know not to start anything. But if the Jedi down there are foolish enough to start something, we will finish it, the Commodore declared. The final straw was Windu's declaration that the Jedi would leave for the Senate to debate Vale's fate. Under the circumstances, that was madness. For all anyone knew, the senators might be all dead already. Palion was not going to allow one of the Republic's best generals, not to mention his acting commander-in-chief, to rot in prison for months, or if they were really unlucky, years, until the Senate managed to sort itself out, and be able to deal with the Jedi's accusations. At least that was what he would say if anyone asked him. But there would be something else he would leave unsaid. Gilad knew that there were some senators that were too close to comfort to the Jedi Council. If some of those survived, it was likely that, guilty or not, the general would find himself in a tough spot without having done anything wrong. It was a hard thing to admit, but the government he had sworn to protect had its flaws, some of which were pretty big. He would have had to be blind to not be aware of the rampant corruption within the Senate. Gilad knew that the Chancellor was doing his best to clean up the monumental mess, but the man's efforts were often not enough. If he looked at it objectively, Palion knew that the systems making the Sith often had legitimate grievances and reasons to secede. However, that did not mean he agreed with the way they went about it. At all. He hated being placed in position where he had to deal with politics. Palion nodded when he received reports that the Navy ships in orbit had acknowledged his orders and were executing them. Now he could only wait and see how the crisis on the ground was resolved. == Great Hall,
Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Obi-Wan had felt the disturbance in the Force before his command ship exited hyperspace near Coruscant. However, the truth about what was happening was much worse than his greatest fears. Gar High Command attacked and silent. The Senate, with most of the government in attendance, in enemy hands. The bases near that building attacked and under lockdown, and even the Jedi Temple under assault. The Jedi General had wasted no time to act. He sent Cody with the bulk of the troops on the Negotiator to join the cordon forming around the Senate while he left to aid his fellow Jedi. He was informed by Commodore Palion, one of Vale's protégés, that the general had taken command of the situation and was already on his way to the temple. That was a cause for a bit of relief. After all, the general knew what he was doing, but it had lasted only until the Lats with Kenobi's acquaintance reached the temple and activated cameras relaying to all GAR units in the system what was happening. To say that Obi-Wan was appalled by the destruction and the death toll he was seeing with his own eyes would be an understatement. Yet, the Jedi Master was glad that Del-Katar arrived in time to save at least the two girls, Anakin's Padawan, who just like her master was pursued actively by trouble, and was that Luminara's apprentice lying wounded on the ground. While he did not approve of the blatant use of the dark side powers displayed by Vale for Obi-Wan's fears that the man was going to lose himself in the dark turned out to be unfounded. Del-Katar even saved one of the women he fought after killing Ventress. He idly wondered what was that about Valley of the Jedi they all heard, but decided it could wait. Thanks to the audio pickups mounted on those two Lats, Kenobi and all other people receiving the signal could hear what was being said in the Great Hall. Soon things turned out for the worse. Windu had appeared and started to argue with both Yoda and Ahsoka Tano. It was inevitable, really. From the beginning, Obi-Wan knew that once the true identity of Vale was known to the rank and file of the Order, there would be hell to pay. Unfortunately, most Jedi were not as open-minded as himself. He knew that the Order was far from perfect but still believed that it was the best way to keep Force sensitives from the corruption of the dark side. Yet, now, after some long conversations with Vale, Kenobi's faith in his Order's teaching was wavering. It was hard to argue with Del-Katar when Windu was showing for all to see some of the worst failings of the Jedi Order as an institution. That this display was made by one of the most respected Jedi Masters made it even worse. Obi-Wan was praying that the gunships could travel even faster. He could see the clones who had arrived with Vale ready to resist the Jedi if they attempted to arrest their general. He glanced at the men in the troop compartment with him. Their helmets did not give any hint what they were going to do, but he doubted that they would stand against their brothers. Most likely the clones would follow the military regulations, and the troopers knew that Vale had assumed command of all GAR forces. Kenobi prayed that he would be able to defuse the situation. Anything less and his actions would just add to the body count. =RK=. The good news was that Obi-Wan arrived at the temple before the situation exploded in everyone's faces. He jumped from the hovering transport after ordering the medics he had brought to take care of the wounded. He frowned when he saw his clone troopers joining Vale's men and taking defensive positions. This had the potential to become very ugly. Kenobi did not know if his fellow Jedi were aware that everything was going live, but considering what he felt from Windu and some of the men and women facing the clones, he doubted that they would care anyway. How did we end like this? Wondered the Jedi Master. Obi-Wan walked between Del-Katar and Mace, who were glaring at each other. Kenobi nodded respectfully to Yoda, and then turned to Padawan Tano, ignoring Windu for the moment. Ahsoka, I see you've learned how to get into all kind of trouble from my former apprentice. I should have a talk with that boy about what he is teaching you, he said with a straight face, looking at her wounded right hand. Ah, that. It's just a scratch, Master Kenobi, exclaimed the young Togruta. Good to hear it. What about the shouting match you are having with two council members? Ahsoka looked uneasy for a moment, but then her azure eyes blazed with determination, and she stood straighter. Master Windu is being entirely unreasonable, she declared with conviction ringing in her voice. Is he, now? Muttered Obi-Wan and turned his gaze towards the fuming Vapad Master. Meanwhile Yoda was watching the antics of the younger Jedi with an amused smirk on his face. He could feel the tension bleeding out of the Jedi present in the Great Hall. Only Windu was refusing to let go of his anger. That was not good for so many reasons. Master Windu, I missed most of the excitement. Please enlighten me, what is going on? We all have more important issues to deal with. Should I remind you that, The Senate is under enemy control, and the senators are hostages? Not to mention that the confusion of these attacks could give the Sith Navy opportunity to strike targets that were previously out of their reach. The GAR reaction speed is crippled until we can clean up the mess on Coruscant, added Vale. Kenobi nodded in agreement. The Separatists would be fools not to capitalize on the Republic's confusion, but before such things could be dealt with, the immediate crisis had to be averted. Windu pointed an accusing finger at Del-Qatar, who rolled his eyes at the Jedi. He is the greatest threat to both the Jedi Order and the Republic I can see, stated Mace. This madness, end now, it must, grumbled Yoda. Sometime during the argument he had summoned his crooked cane and now used it to strike Windu in the shins. The look on the Jedi Master's face was priceless. Stand down, you will, Master Windu. The irritation the Grand Master felt towards his much younger colleague was plain to see. The future shrouded in darkness is torn asunder by paranoia we must not be. Master Windu. Suspended your position it is. The Jedi Council your actions will judge. Yoda's tone of voice brooked no argument. The Vapad Master glared at the tiny Jedi but managed to rein in his fury. He is a Sith. Our ancient enemy. How long must we wait for him to act against us? Pleaded Windu. Has Vale done anything to warrant such animosity, Master Windu? Asked Kenobi with exasperation in his voice. The Confederacy and the Sith leading it, our enemies are. Del-Qatar Vale that man is not. Today too much death we saw. More bloodshed your actions would have caused, Master Windu. Yoda pointed his cane Del-Qatar's way. Shown hostility towards the Jedi, he has not. The Grand Master of the Jedi Order glared at Mace. Master Windu. When the current crisis over is, explain your actions to us all you will. Obi-Wan allowed himself to relax a bit for the first time since he first sensed the disturbance in the Force that heralded the attacks on Coruscant. He could sense the same being true for both Jedi and clones. Even the aura of danger surrounding Vale had subdued a bit. That had been much too close for comfort. Kenobi knew that the consequences of Windu's stunt would be grave, though he was mentally thanking the Force that the worst did not come to pass. Master Yoda, I hope that at least Dooku remains in custody? Vale asked almost innocently, but Obi-Wan could see that the question was anything but. Yoda looked at Mace Windu with interest, and soon everyone who was not too busy tending to the wounded turned their heads towards the Jedi Master, who looked uncomfortable with the attention. Obi-Wan had a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach.